The airport was a madhouse that day, buzzing like a kicked-over beehive. Footsteps pounded the linoleum, dragging suitcases screeched, and the garbled intercom crackled with announcements about delayed flights. At Gate 17, the line for the Boeing 737 snaked around like a restless python, passengers fidgeting, clutching phones, eyes darting to the flickering departure boards. Everyone just wanted out of the terminal's stale, suffocating air. But then everything froze. A sharp, unmistakable sound sliced through the chaos, smack. A hand striking flesh, loud and clear as a thunderclap on a cloudless day. The crowd went dead silent, heads whipping toward the boarding gate. A cane clattered to the floor, spinning a few lazy circles before coming to a stop. And there, at the center of every stunned gaze, stood a tiny black woman, about 80 years old, steadying herself with a trembling hand clutching the frayed edge of her worn-out coat. Her name was Ruth Jackson. She wore a threadbare brown sweater patched up at the elbows, a pair of scuffed black canvas shoes that looked like they'd trudged 100 dusty roads, and a faded gray headscarf tied neatly over her silver-streaked hair. Her skin was dark as polished ebony, etched with deep lines that told a story of decades lived hard and long, but her eyes, those eyes were sharp, piercing, like they held a lifetime of patience and grit behind them. A few stray strands of white hair peeked out from the scarf, swaying gently as she bent to retrieve her cane. Nothing about Ruth screamed first class. No designer handbag, no gold watch, not even a smartphone. She looked like somebody's grandma, the kind you'd see perched on a park bench, tossing crumbs to pigeons with a quiet smile. But today Ruth wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a secret waiting to unravel. Across from her stood Jessica Jess Harper, a 38-year-old flight attendant built like a tower of authority at the gate. Tall and wiry, Jess had blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun, lips thin and painted cherry red, now pressed into a hard, tense line. Her navy blue airline uniform hugged her frame, the veteran flight attendant badge glinting on her chest like a medal declaring she knew her shit. Her green eyes raked over Ruth with naked contempt, like the old woman was a smudge on the floor she had to wipe away. 15 years working the skies had honed Jess's knack for sizing up passengers in a heartbeat, who was a big-shot exec who was a luxury tourist, and who was a nobody who didn't belong. To Jess, Ruth was clearly the latter. Headphone, welcome to Soul Deep Stories. Glowing star, if you're deeply immersed in this story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss more heart-touching stories. Sparkling heart. Pushpin, I have a small challenge for you. Comment below and let us know which country you're listening from and what time it is. For example, I'm in New York, USA, enjoying this story at 9 p.m. Crescent Moon. How about you? Let's connect with each other from all around the world. Globe showing Europe, Africa sparkles. Speech balloon, don't forget to like and share to spread these meaningful stories to more people. Thank you for being a part of Soul Deep Stories. Red heart. What the hell's this old bat doing here? Jess muttered under her breath, just low enough that no one caught it, but her eyes screamed disgust loud and clear. She leaned down, snatching the boarding pass from Ruth's hand, her red-painted nails digging into the paper like she wanted to rip it to shreds. Listen up, lady, this is the first-class line, not your spot, Jess snapped, her voice cutting like a switchblade, laced with that American sarcasm that says get lost without bothering with manners. You deaf or just senile? Economy's over there. She jabbed a finger toward the other gate, her tone sharp like she was scolding a slow kid. Ruth didn't flinch. She stood there, small but steady, her bony hands tightening around the cane she just picked up. Her voice came low and slow, carrying the deep drawl of the American South, where she'd grown up among cotton fields and red dirt roads. I know where I am, she said, locking eyes with Jess without a blink. My ticket's for first class. It wasn't loud, but it had weight, like a church bell tolling through a storm. Jess barked a laugh, short and raspy, dripping with mockery. First class? You. She shook her head, that blonde bun staying perfectly in place. Look, Grandma, I don't have time for your games. I deal with 100 wannabes like you every day, thinking you can sneak into the fancy seats with a fake ticket or some sob story. Not on my watch. She held the boarding pass up to the light, squinting at it like it was counterfeit cash, then smirked. Who gave you this? Your grandson printed off his laptop at home? The crowd started buzzing. A few heads turned, curious. Others pretended to scroll their phones but leaned in to eavesdrop. A young businessman, David Brooks, standing nearby with a Starbucks cup in hand, paused mid-sip, frowning as he sensed something off. He didn't speak up, not yet, but the scene was already spiraling. Ruth stayed quiet, letting Jess run her mouth. But when the old woman didn't back down, Jess's razor-thin patience snapped. You gone mute now? I said move it, she snarled, stepping closer, her heels clicking on the floor like hammer strikes. And then, in a flash of unchecked fury, Jess lunged, not with a gentle shove but with a grab. Her hand shot out, fingers hooking into the collar of Ruth's ratty sweater, yanking hard. The old woman stumbled forward, frail frame jerking under the force. "You think you can stand here and mouth off to me, you doddering old hag? Get the hell out of my way before I have security drag your ass out." Ruth's cane slipped again, clattering to the floor with a hollow ring that echoed through the gate like a warning ignored. The crowd wasn't whispering anymore, they were holding their breath. A young mom, Sarah Coleman, a few steps away, clutched her toddler tighter, her jaw dropping in shock. David Brooks's coffee hit the floor, brown liquid splashing across his shoes, but he didn't care. Every eye was glued to the sight. A tiny black woman, fragile and unassuming, being manhandled like trash by a flight attendant in broad daylight. Jess let go, shoving Ruth back a step, her eyes blazing. "I told you, don't waste my damn time." Her voice rose, raw and ugly, no filter left. "You don't belong here. Look at you. That raggedy-ass sweater, that busted cane. First class is for people with money, with class, not some broke-down old crone like you." Ruth staggered but didn't fall. She braced herself against the check-in counter, rising slowly. Her thin hands trembled from the jolt, but her face stayed eerily calm. She bent down again, picking up her cane with deliberate care, every move measured like she'd planned it. When she straightened, those deep black eyes fixed on Jess, not with anger, not with fear, but with a stillness that made the air feel thick. The crowd felt it too, a shift, like this little old lady had just grabbed hold of something no one saw coming. Her voice broke the silence, low and clear, like a judge passing sentence in a hushed courtroom. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, girl." It wasn't some over-the-top threat you'd hear in a movie, it was real, grounded, like a mother warning a wayward kid about the trouble she'd called down. To Jess, though, it was just the ramblings of a crazy old fool. Jess scoffed, crossing her arms, her sneer unshaken. "Biggest mistake of my life? Who the hell do you think you are, threatening me? Some raggedy nobody like you's gonna do what? I'll show you a mistake when security hauls your wrinkled ass outta here." She spun toward a younger attendant nearby, Emily, barking, "Call security now. I'm done with this hag." But before Emily could move, a tall figure emerged from behind the counter. Marcus Tate, a senior airline manager, strode out, his face hard as steel. His black suit was crisp, badge gleaming, and his gaze swept over Jess like a blade. "That's enough," he said, voice low but heavy with authority. "Jess, step aside." Jess whirled around, mouth opening to argue, but Marcus's look stopped her cold. There was something in the way he glanced at Ruth, not pity but deep respect. Marcus stepped forward, dipping his head slightly to the old woman. "Mrs. Jackson, apologies for the delay. Your seat's ready." The crowd held its breath. Jess stood there, still clutching the boarding pass, mouth gaping but silent. Ruth didn't spare her another glance. She nodded faintly at Marcus and started walking, cane tapping steadily on the floor. But just before she disappeared through the boarding door, she turned back, fixing Jess with one last look, cold, unrelenting and clear as day. This was only the beginning. The hum of the airport lounge was a low, steady drone, like the pulse of a city that never sleeps. Soft clinks of coffee cups against saucers mingled with the muffled chatter of travelers, some tapping away at laptops, others staring blankly at the tarmac through floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, planes taxied in slow motion, their silver bodies glinting under the midday sun, while baggage carts buzzed back and forth like ants on a mission. Amid this orchestrated chaos, Ruth Jackson sat alone in a corner near the glass, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized armchair. Her brown sweater hung loose on her shoulders, the patches at the elbows a quiet testament to a life of making do. In her lap, her hands rested gently over the knob of her cane, fingers gnarled but steady, tracing the worn wood like it was an old friend. She gazed out at the plains with a calm that felt ancient, as if she'd watched the world take flight 1,000 times before and knew every beat of its rhythm. Ruth didn't draw attention. Most people didn't give her a second glance, just another old black woman waiting for a flight, blending into the background like a shadow at dusk. Her headscarf was tied tight, a few silver strands peeking out, and her face carried the kind of weariness that comes from decades of carrying more than your share. But there was something else there too, something in the way her lips curved faintly upward, a secret smile that hinted at a story no one bothered to ask about. To the casual eye she was unremarkable, invisible even, a relic in a world obsessed with youth and flash. But Ruth Jackson was no relic. She was a titan in disguise, the woman who'd built this airline from nothing, brick by brick, back when the skies were a white man's playground and a black woman's dreams were laughed off as delusions. She'd clawed her way up from a shotgun house in Alabama, where the roof leaked and the summers burned, to a boardroom where she called the shots. Now at 80 she didn't flaunt it, no private jet, no entourage, just a cane and a quiet dignity that spoke louder than any title ever could. Across the lounge, David Brooks noticed her. He was 29, sharp in a tailored gray suit, his dark hair slicked back, a Starbucks cup steaming in his hand from the overpriced kiosk he'd hit on the way in. He'd been pacing near the window, checking his watch, waiting for the first-class boarding call that was still 10 minutes out. Something about Ruth caught his eye, maybe the way she sat so still while everyone else fidgeted, or the way her hands rested like they'd earned their peace. He tipped his head in a polite nod and stepped over, gesturing to the empty seat beside her. "Mind if I take this?" he asked, voice smooth but genuine, the kind of guy who'd been raised to respect his elders even in a world that didn't anymore. Ruth turned her head slow, those deep eyes sizing him up in a heartbeat. She smiled, small but warm, the kind of smile that made you feel seen. "Go right ahead, son," she said, her southern drawl wrapping around the words like molasses. David hesitated, then sat, crossing one leg over the other. "Long day?" he ventured, figuring she'd brush him off with a polite nod. But Ruth surprised him. "Long life," she replied, her voice low and rich, a chuckle humming beneath it. He grinned, caught off guard, and for a moment, they shared a quiet understanding, two strangers in a sea of noise, connected by nothing but a fleeting kindness. Meanwhile, at the check-in counter, Jess Harper was in her element. The gate area was her kingdom, and she ruled it with the precision of a drill sergeant and the swagger of a small-town queen bee who'd made it big. At 38, she'd spent half her life in the air, climbing the ranks from economy to first class, where she'd planted her flag and dared anyone to challenge her. Her uniform was pristine, every crease ironed sharp, her blonde bun a fortress of control. She moved with a clipped efficiency, barking orders at Emily, the rookie attendant still fumbling with the scanner. "Pick up the pace, Em. Jesus, you'd think you've never seen a boarding pass before." Jess's voice carried that hard-edged sarcasm she'd perfected over years of dealing with late passengers, crying babies, and entitled jerks who thought a $500 ticket bought them a slave. Jess scanned the lounge with a predator's eye, clocking who belonged and who didn't. She'd built a mental checklist over the years. Suits meant money, Rolexes meant status, kids with iPads meant distracted parents who'd tip big to shut them up. She prided herself on it, this sixth sense for spotting the right kind of people, the ones who'd sip champagne at 30,000 feet and thank her for it. Her gaze flicked over David Brooks, young, polished, probably some tech bro with a fat expense account. First-class material, she thought, filing him away. Then her eyes landed on Ruth, and her lip curled like she'd smelled something sour. What's she doing here? Jess didn't even try to hide the sneer tugging at her mouth. To her, Ruth was a glitch in the system, a busted cog that didn't fit the sleek machine of first class. Old, black, poor-looking, she checked all the wrong boxes in Jess's book. Back in her early days, Jess hadn't been this hard. She'd grown up in a nowhere town in Ohio, where the steel mill closed when she was 10 and her dad drank away the mortgage. She'd scrapped her way out, waitressing at a diner until she could afford flight attendant school, swearing she'd never be broke or powerless again. The job gave her control, a uniform that made people listen, a paycheck that let her buy the knockoff Chanel bag she carried like a trophy. But somewhere along the line, that hunger for respect turned into a need to put others in their place. She'd seen too many passengers, too many people, look through her like she was nothing, and she'd vowed never to let it happen again. Now she wielded her authority like a club, and Ruth Jackson, with her patched sweater and slow shuffle, was the kind of person Jess had learned to despise, weak, outdated, beneath her. Ruth didn't notice Jess's stare, or if she did, she didn't care. She leaned back in her chair, watching a plane climb into the sky, its engines roaring like a promise kept. She'd been 16 the first time she saw a plane up close, back in '61, when she'd snuck onto an airfield with her brother to watch the crop dusters. The white pilot had caught them, chased them off with a string of curses and a raised fist, but Ruth hadn't run scared. She'd stood there, mesmerized by the wings cutting through the air, and told herself she'd own one someday. It took 30 years, cleaning offices at night, saving every dime, pitching her idea to bankers who laughed in her face until one finally didn't. She'd started with a single prop plane, ferrying mail across state lines, and turned it into an empire. Now her name was on every jet in this fleet, etched in fine print on the fuselage, but she didn't need anyone to know it. Power to Ruth wasn't about shouting, it was about building something that lasted. David shifted beside her, sipping his coffee. You fly a lot? He asked, more to keep the conversation going than anything else. Ruth's eyes crinkled at the corners. More than most, she said, cryptic but playful. He chuckled, liking her already. I'm on the red-eye every week, New York to LA. Gets old fast. Ruth nodded, like she understood more than he'd let on. Gets easier when you know why you're doing it, she said, and there was a weight to her words that made David pause, wondering what she meant. At the counter, Jess was already moving on, snapping her fingers at Emily to hurry up with the boarding announcements. First class first, then the cattle call, let's go. Her voice was loud, brassy, cutting through the lounge like a foghorn. She loved this part, the moment she got to play gatekeeper, sorting the VIPs from the riffraff. It fed something in her, that rush of deciding who got through and who got left behind. She'd spent too many nights as a kid watching her mom beg the landlord for one more week, too many days being the girl nobody noticed. Now she was the one with the clipboard, the one who said yes or no, and it felt damn good. When the first class call crackled over the speakers, Ruth stirred. She gripped her cane, pushing herself up with a quiet grunt, her movements slow but deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. The crowd parted around her as she shuffled toward the gate, her steps steady despite the slight limp. David watched her go, a flicker of curiosity in his chest. Something about her didn't add up, but he couldn't place it. Jess, though, saw her coming and stiffened, her jaw tightening like a coiled spring. Here we go, she thought, already smelling trouble. To Jess, Ruth wasn't just out of place. She was an insult, a walking challenge to everything Jess had built her identity around. Ruth reached the counter, her boarding pass clutched in one hand, the paper creased from years of handling things with care. She handed it over without a word, her face calm, almost serene. Jess snatched it, barely glancing at it before her eyes narrowed. Ma'am, this is first class, she said, her tone dripping with condescension, like she was talking to a lost tourist. Ruth nodded once. I know, she replied, simple and soft, her voice a stark contrast to Jess's bite. Jess froze for a split second, then laughed, a harsh, grating sound that made Emily flinch behind her. You know? Oh honey, I don't think you do. She tilted her head, sizing Ruth up like a hawk eyeing a mouse. This ain't the bus station, sweetheart. First class is for people who can afford it, not. She waved a hand at Ruth's sweater, her cane, her everything. Not this. Her voice was loud enough to carry, and a few heads turned, the air thickening with second-hand embarrassment. Ruth didn't budge. She stood there, small but unyielding, her eyes locked on Jess with that same quiet intensity from before. Check the ticket, she said, steady as stone. Jess's smirk faltered just for a moment, but then it was back, sharper than ever. Oh, I'll check it, all right, she muttered, holding the pass up like it was evidence in a crime scene. She scanned it, expecting an error, a fake, something she could wave in the old woman's face and send her packing. But the scanner beeped green and Jess's stomach dropped. The seat number flashed on the screen. 1A. First class, front row. Her fingers tightened around the paper, knuckles whitening. This has to be a mistake, she said, more to herself than to Ruth, her voice losing its edge for the first time. She looked up, searching the line behind Ruth for someone, anyone, who could explain this. A caregiver, a grandkid, somebody who'd screwed up and given this nobody a ticket she didn't deserve. But there was no one. Just Ruth, alone, staring back at her like she'd already won. Jess's face hardened. No way, she snapped, shaking her head. I don't know how you got this, but you're not sitting there. Her voice rose again, sharp and defiant, clinging to the control she could feel slipping. Step aside, lady, before I make you. The threat hung heavy, a promise of what was coming, and the crowd shifted uneasily, sensing the storm brewing. Ruth didn't move. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze cutting through Jess like a blade through butter. There's no mistake, she said, her voice soft but firm, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman who didn't know she needed it. Jess's chest heaved, her pride warring with the sinking realization that she might have just stepped in something she couldn't scrape off her shoe. And Ruth just waited, her calm a quiet fire that was about to burn everything Jess thought she knew to the ground. The air at gate 17 crackled with a tension so thick you could choke on it. The line of passengers stretched back into the terminal, a restless herd of suits and carry-ons, their murmurs rising like static as the first-class boarding call echoed overhead. The scanner beeped sporadically, Emily's shaky hands fumbling with each pass, her wide eyes darting between the growing crowd and Jess Harper, who loomed over the counter like a thunderhead ready to burst. Jess's red-painted nails tapped an impatient rhythm on the desk, her jaw clenched tight enough to crack walnuts. She'd already decided Ruth Jackson didn't belong here, ticket or no ticket, and every second the old woman stood her ground was another jab at Jess's fragile kingdom. The green beep from the scanner, the 1A flashing on the screen, hadn't changed a damn thing in her mind. This was her turf, her rules, and she wasn't about to let some raggedy grandma make a fool of her. Ruth stood firm, her small frame a quiet anchor in the storm. Her patched sweater hung loose, her cane planted like a flag, and those deep, unyielding eyes locked on Jess with a calm that felt like a dare. She'd handed over her boarding pass, creased and worn like everything she owned, and said her piece. There's no mistake. Her voice was steady, low, carrying the weight of a woman who'd faced worse than this and walked away taller. But to Jess, it was a spark tossed on dry grass and she was ready to burn it all down. No mistake. Jess's laugh was a jagged thing, sharp and mean, slicing through the hum of the gate. She snatched a styrofoam coffee cup from the counter, her third of the day black as tar and still steaming, and waved it in Ruth's direction, her smirk twisting into something ugly. You hear this, folks? Grandma here thinks she's some first-class hotshot. She turned to the crowd, playing for an audience, her voice booming like a carny barking at a sideshow. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, others smirked, but most just stared, caught in the slow-motion wreck unfolding before them. Jess leaned in closer, towering over Ruth, her green eyes flashing with venom. "Let me paint you a picture, sweetheart," she sneered, her Ohio twang sharpening every word. "First class is for winners, people with fat wallets and private jets, not some broke-ass fossil who looks like she crawled out of a thrift store dumpster." She jabbed a finger at Ruth's sweater, the patched elbows a bullseye for her scorn. "You think that ticket's real? Bullshit. Somebody's screwing with me and I ain't playing your game." Ruth didn't flinch. Her hands tightened around her cane, knuckles whitening under her dark skin, but her face stayed stone still, like she'd heard this song before and knew the ending. "Check it again," she said, her southern drawl slow and deliberate, a lifeline Jess was too far gone to grab. The crowd hushed, the air growing heavier, every eye pinned on the two women locked in a standoff that felt bigger than the gate. Jess's smirk vanished, replaced by a snarl that bared her teeth. "Check it again? Oh, I'll do you one better, you old hag." She slammed the boarding pass down on the counter, grabbed her coffee cup tighter, and, whether by accident or spite no one could say for sure, tilted it forward. The scalding liquid sloshed out, splashing across Ruth's chest in a dark, steaming wave. The brown sweater soaked it up instantly, the heat seeping through to her frail frame, and a sharp gasp escaped her lips. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quick intake of breath that cut deeper than any scream. The gate erupted. Sarah Coleman, the young mom clutching her toddler a few feet back, let out a choked, "Oh my God," her hand flying to her mouth. David Brooks, still holding his own spilled coffee's empty cup, took a step forward, his face paling as the scene sank in. "Hey, what the hell?" he barked, his voice cracking with disbelief. Emily froze behind the counter, her scanner slipping from her hands to clatter on the desk, her eyes wide with panic. Passengers gasped, whispered, some pulling out phones to record the chaos, the air buzzing with shock and outrage. But Jess didn't care. She stood there, coffee dripping from the cup's rim onto the floor, her chest heaving, her face flushed with a twisted triumph. "Look at you now," Jess bellowed, her voice a raw, unhinged roar. She tossed the empty cup aside, it bounced off the counter and rolled underfoot, and stepped closer, looming over Ruth like a vulture over carrion. "You're a damn mess, you know that? A walking joke. You think you can waltz in here with your busted cane and your welfare rags and demand a seat with the big dogs? Get real." She grabbed Ruth's arm this time, not the collar but the thin, trembling wrist, yanking it up like she was shaking sense into a disobedient kid. "I oughta throw you out on your ass myself, you miserable old bitch." Ruth stumbled, her cane wobbling as her balance faltered, but she caught herself against the counter, her free hand gripping the edge. The coffee soaked deeper, staining her sweater a muddy brown, the heat stinging her skin, but her eyes never left Jess. They burned now, not with anger but with something fiercer, something ancient and unyielding, like a fire that had been smoldering for decades and was finally ready to blaze. The crowd saw it, felt it, a shift so palpable it sucked the air from the room. Sarah's toddler started crying, a high-pitched wail that mirrored the tension snapping around them. David dropped his cup entirely, stepping closer, his fists clenching. "Lady, you need to back off, now," he snapped, his voice shaking with a mix of fury and fear. Jess ignored him, ignored everyone. She let go of Ruth's wrist, shoving her back a step, and planted her hands on her hips, chest thrust out like she'd just won a bar fight. You hear that, huh? Nobody wants you here, she spat, her words dripping with venom, each one a dagger aimed at Ruth's dignity. You're nothing, just a sad, dried-up nobody who's got no business breathing the same air as us. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of, you pathetic piece of trash. Her voice cracked on the last word, shrill and wild, echoing off the terminal walls like a gunshot. The silence that followed was deafening. Ruth straightened slowly, her soaked sweater clinging to her, her cane tapping the floor once as she steadied herself. Coffee dripped from her chest to the linoleum, pooling around her worn shoes, but she didn't wipe it away. She didn't shout back, didn't curse, didn't even blink. She just stood there, small and unbowed, and when she spoke, her voice was a quiet thunder that rolled over Jess like a tidal wave. You're digging your own grave, girl, she said, low and steady, her southern accent wrapping the words in a gravitas that made the hairs on Emily's neck stand up. It wasn't a threat, it was a prophecy, delivered with the calm of someone who'd seen storms come and go and knew this one was about to break. Jess laughed again, but it was hollow now, a nervous edge creeping in. My grave? Oh, please, you senile old cow. She turned to Emily, her eyes wild. Call security right now. I want this freak out of here before I lose my damn mind. Emily hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached for the phone, her gaze flicking to Ruth like she was begging for forgiveness. The crowd was splitting now, some backing away, others stepping closer, phones still rolling, capturing every second of Jess's unraveling. David shoved through the line, his suit jacket flapping as he planted himself between Jess and Ruth. You're out of line, he yelled, his voice raw, his face red with a fury he hadn't known he had. You don't get to treat people like this, ticket or not, she's a human being. Sarah nodded behind him, her toddler still whimpering, her own eyes brimming with tears. She's right, you're a bully, she called, her voice shaking but firm. The murmurs grew louder, a chorus of dissent rising against Jess, but she didn't hear it. She was too far gone, her world narrowing to the old woman who dared to defy her. Jess rounded on David, her finger jabbing at his chest. Stay out of this, pretty boy, or you're next, she snarled, but her bravado was cracking, her hands shaking as the reality of the moment pressed in. She turned back to Ruth, her breath ragged, her face a mask of rage and desperation. You think you've won something? You're nothing, nothing. I'll make sure you never step foot on this plane, you hear me? You're done. Before she could lunge again, a shadow fell over the counter. Marcus Tate's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Jessica Harper, stand down, he barked, his tall frame filling the space behind her, his suit crisp and his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His dark eyes locked on Jess, hard as granite, and the authority in his tone hit her like a slap. The crowd parted as he stepped forward, his presence a wall she couldn't climb. What the hell do you think you're doing? He demanded, his voice low but lethal, every word a hammer strike. Jess froze, coffee-stained hands dropping to her sides, her chest heaving as the fight drained out of her. I was just, she stammered, but Marcus didn't let her finish. He turned to Ruth, his expression softening, a flicker of something like reverence in his eyes. Mrs. Jackson, he said, dipping his head, I'm so sorry for this. Your seat's waiting, let me take you there myself. Ruth nodded, slow and deliberate, her soaked sweater still dripping, her cane tapping as she straightened fully. She didn't look at Jess, not yet. She took a step forward, the crowd parting like the Red Sea, every eye following her. But just before she followed Marcus, she turned, her gaze settling on Jess one last time. Those eyes, deep, fierce, unforgiving, pierced through her like a spear. You'll see, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it landed like a bomb. And then she was gone, disappearing through the gate, leaving Jess standing in a puddle of coffee and shame, the weight of her own words crashing down around her. The boarding gate was a battlefield, the air thick with the acrid scent of spilled coffee and the electric hum of a crowd teetering on the edge. Ruth Jackson stood just beyond the counter, her small frame dripping with the dark stain Jess Harper had flung at her, the soaked sweater clinging to her like a second skin. Her cane tapped once against the floor, a quiet metronome in the chaos as she faced Jess with eyes that burned through the haze, steady, unyielding, a lighthouse in a storm she'd weathered before. The passengers around her were a chorus of gasps and murmurs, their phones still raised, capturing every heartbeat of the disaster Jess had unleashed. David Brooks stood rigid a few feet away, his fists balled tight, his face flushed with a fury he could barely contain. Sarah Coleman clutched her crying toddler, her own eyes wet with a mix of shock and righteous anger. Emily, behind the counter, was a statue of panic, her hands hovering over the phone she'd been ordered to use, her breath shallow as the scene spiraled beyond her grasp. Jess Harper was a live wire, her chest heaving, her blonde bun fraying at the edges as strands slipped loose in her frenzy. The empty coffee cup lay crumpled at her feet, a casualty of her rage, and her red-painted nails dug into her palms as she glared at Ruth. "You're done, you hear me?" she snarled, her voice raw and ragged, cracking like glass under pressure. "I don't care what that damn scanner says, you're not getting on my plane, you filthy old witch." Her words were a venomous spray, each one a desperate swing to reclaim the control slipping through her fingers. She poured everything into this moment, years of clawing her way up, of proving she wasn't the nobody from that dead-end Ohio town, and now this little old lady was unraveling it all with a ticket and a look that made Jess feel small. The crowd was turning now, their whispers swelling into a tide of dissent. "She's got a ticket. Let her through," a man in a baseball cap shouted from the back, his voice rough with indignation. "This is bullshit," a woman in a business suit chimed in, her arms crossed tight. David stepped closer, his voice cutting through the din. "You're done here, lady. Back off before you make this worse." His tone was sharp, a warning wrapped in a plea, but Jess barely registered it. Her world had narrowed to Ruth, to the defiance in those dark eyes, and she was ready to double down, to drag this fight into the dirt if it meant she came out on top. But before she could take another step, the air shifted, a heavy, commanding presence slicing through the chaos like a guillotine. Marcus Tate's voice boomed from behind the counter, deep and unyielding, a sound that didn't just demand attention but seized it. "Jessica Harper, stand down, now." His tall frame emerged from the shadows of the gate's back office, his black suit impeccable, his badge catching the fluorescent light like a beacon of authority. His dark eyes locked on Jess with a fury so cold it could have frozen the coffee still pooling at her feet. The crowd parted instinctively as he strode forward, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum with a rhythm that promised reckoning. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. Every syllable carried the weight of a man who'd seen enough and wasn't here to negotiate. Jess spun toward him, her face a mask of defiance and desperation, coffee-stained hands clenching into fists. "Marcus, this isn't what it looks like," she stammered, her voice pitching high, a frantic edge creeping in. She's got a fake ticket or something, I was just doing my job." The lie tumbled out, clumsy and hollow, and even she didn't believe it. Marcus stopped a foot from her, his 6'3" frame towering over her wiry build, his jaw set like granite. "Your job?" he repeated, his tone low and lethal, each word a slow burn. "Your job is to pour coffee on passengers? To scream at them like some back-alley thug? Step aside." The command landed like a punch, and Jess flinched, her bravado cracking under the weight of his stare. She opened her mouth to argue, but Marcus didn't give her the chance. He turned to Ruth, his expression softening in an instant, a flicker of reverence breaking through his steel facade. "Mrs. Jackson," he said, dipping his head in a gesture that was almost a bow, "I apologize for this disgrace. Your seat's ready, I'll walk you there myself." His voice was steady, respectful, a lifeline extended with a quiet dignity that made the crowd lean in, sensing something bigger than they'd grasped. Ruth nodded, slow and deliberate, her soaked sweater still dripping onto the floor, her cane tapping as she adjusted her stance. She didn't rush, didn't gloat, just stood there, small but monumental, a figure carved from decades of resilience. The coffee stain was a badge now, a mark of what she'd endured and risen above. She took a step toward Marcus, the crowd parting like a tide, every eye tracing her path. But before she moved fully past Jess, she paused, turning her head just enough to meet the flight attendant's wild gaze. "You'll see," she said, her voice a whisper that cut deeper than any shout, a promise wrapped in a warning. Then she turned away, following Marcus toward the jet bridge, her cane's steady rhythm a drumbeat of inevitability. Jess stood frozen, her breath hitching as the reality crashed in. The crowd's murmurs turned to a roar, some cheering Ruth's exit, others hurling insults at Jess. "You're a damn disgrace," Sarah Coleman yelled, her toddler still sniffling against her shoulder, her own voice thick with tears. David shook his head, his fists unclenching as he muttered, "Unbelievable," under his breath, his eyes tracking Ruth's departure with a mix of awe and guilt for not stepping in sooner. Emily finally moved, scrambling to pick up the scanner she dropped, her hands shaking as she whispered, oh God," like a prayer to undo what she'd witnessed. Marcus didn't look back as he guided Ruth through the gate, his broad shoulders a shield against the chaos left behind. But once they were out of sight, he slowed, glancing down at her with a question in his eyes. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice softer now, laced with a concern that went beyond protocol. Ruth adjusted her grip on her cane, the coffee still clinging to her sweater, and gave him a faint smile. "I've been through worse, Marcus," she said, her southern drawl warm but firm. "A little coffee ain't gonna break me." He nodded, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips, but his jaw tightened as he glanced back toward the gate. "She's gonna pay for this," he said, more to himself than to her, his tone dark with resolve. Back at the counter, Jess felt the ground tilt beneath her. The crowd's voices were a wall pressing in, their judgment a weight she couldn't shake. She stumbled back a step, her heels slipping in the coffee puddle, her hands clutching the edge of the desk to steady herself. This isn't fair," she choked out, her voice breaking as she scanned the faces glaring at her. "I was doing my job. She didn't belong here." But the words sounded weak now, a child's whine against the tide turning against her. She caught Sarah's glare, David's disgust, and the phone still pointed her way, recording her fall in real time. Her chest burned, her throat tight with a panic she hadn't felt since the nights she'd hid from her dad's drunken rages, a kid with nowhere to run. Marcus's voice echoed in her head, "Stand down," and it hit her like a sledgehammer. He wasn't just her boss. He was the guy who'd trained her, who'd vouched for her when she'd screwed up early on, who'd seen something in her she'd long since buried under layers of bitterness. And now he'd turned his back, siding with the old woman she'd humiliated. Jess's hands shook as she gripped the counter, her mind racing for a way out, a justification, anything to claw back the power she'd lost. But there was nothing, just the coffee-stained floor, the crowd's condemnation, and the sinking realization that she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The jet bridge stretched ahead as Marcus and Ruth moved toward the plane, the hum of the terminal fading behind them. Ruth's steps were slow but sure, her cane tapping a rhythm that matched the steady beat of her heart. Marcus glanced at her again, his brow furrowing. "You didn't have to let her go that far," he said, his voice low, almost a confession. "I could have stopped it sooner." Ruth shook her head, her smile sharpening with a wisdom he couldn't quite touch. "Sometimes folks need to show you who they are, Marcus," she said. "She did me a favor, now everybody knows." He didn't argue. He'd worked for Ruth long enough to know she played a longer game than most. Decades of building an airline from a single plane to a fleet, of outsmarting men who dismissed her before she'd even opened her mouth. She didn't need to raise her voice, she let the world catch up to her truth. As they reached the plane's door, Marcus held it open, his hand steady. "After you, Mrs. Jackson," he said, and there was pride in his voice, a quiet salute to the woman who'd just turned a gate into a stage and Jess Harper into a cautionary tale. Back at the gate, Jess slumped against the counter, her legs trembling as the crowd began to disperse, their phones pocketing the evidence of her meltdown. The first-class line resumed, Emily taking over with a shaky efficiency, but Jess couldn't move. Her uniform, once her armor, was splattered with coffee, her badge dulled by the mess she'd made. She heard Marcus's words again, felt Ruth's eyes boring into her, and for the first time in years she felt exposed, not as the queen of the skies, but as the scared kid she'd buried, the one who'd fought so hard to never be weak again only to break herself in front of everyone. A voice crackled over the intercom, cool and professional. "First-class passengers, please proceed to boarding." It was Emily stepping up, her tone a lifeline Jess couldn't reach. The line moved past her, eyes averted or glaring, and Jess stood there, alone in the wreckage, the taste of coffee and regret bitter on her tongue. She'd wanted to prove something, to Ruth, to herself, to the world, but all she'd done was hand the old woman a victory she hadn't even had to fight for. And as the jet bridge door closed behind Ruth and Marcus, Jess knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a fall she couldn't stop. Below is the continuation of the story, specifically Point 5, Consequences During the Flight, rewritten in English with intensified emotional depth, gripping suspense, and a narrative that pulls the reader into the raw aftermath of the gate incident. This version remains consistent with the renamed characters from previous rewrites, Ruth Jackson, Jessica Jess Harper, Marcus Tate, David Brooks, Sarah Coleman and Emily, and flows seamlessly from the emotions and events of parts 1 through 4. It avoids repeating prior content, focusing instead on the tense, claustrophobic atmosphere aboard the plane as Jess faces the fallout of her actions under the watchful eyes of passengers and crew. The piece is approximately 4,000 words, steeped in authentic American cultural resonance, shame, redemption, and the weight of accountability. The Boeing 737 hummed at 30,000 feet, its engines a steady growl that vibrated through the cabin like a heartbeat. The first-class section was a bubble of muted luxury, plush seats, soft lighting, the faint clink of glassware as passengers sipped complimentary drinks. But beneath the polished surface, the air was thick with an unspoken tension, a live current that crackled between the rows. Ruth Jackson sat in 1A, her small frame settled into the wide leather seat, her soaked sweater swapped for a dry blanket a younger attendant had quietly offered. Her cane rested against the armrest, its worn handle catching the overhead light, and her hands folded calmly in her lap, tracing the edges of the fabric with a patience that felt eternal. She gazed out the window at the endless stretch of clouds, her dark eyes reflecting a sky she'd conquered decades ago, a serenity that belied the storm she'd just walked through. Across the aisle, David Brooks nursed a bourbon, his suit jacket draped over the seat beside him, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm against the glass. He'd boarded with a tight nod to Ruth, a silent acknowledgement of the chaos he'd witnessed, but his jaw stayed clenched, his mind replaying Jess Harper's meltdown at the gate. Sarah Coleman sat a row back, her toddler now asleep against her chest, her own hands trembling slightly as she sipped water, still rattled by the ugliness she'd seen unfold. The other passengers, suits and ties, a few designer-clad tourists, kept their heads down, flipping through magazines or scrolling screens, but their stolen glances told the truth. They were waiting, watching, sensing the reckoning that hung over the cabin like a storm cloud ready to break. Jess Harper moved through the aisle like a ghost, her uniform still flecked with coffee stains, her blonde bun unraveling into a mess of loose strands that framed her flushed face. Her badge hung crooked, a dented shield of an authority she'd torched back at the gate. She carried a tray of drinks, water, wine, a single scotch, her hands unsteady, the glasses clinking faintly as she fought to keep them balanced. Every step felt like a march to the gallows, every pair of eyes a jury she couldn't face. She'd boarded the plane under Marcus Tate's orders, his parting words ringing in her ears, "You're on this flight, Harper. You deal with her yourself." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a sentence, and now she was trapped in this metal tube with the woman she'd humiliated, the passengers who'd seen it, and the shame she couldn't outrun. She reached Ruth's seat, her breath catching as she forced herself to stop. The old woman didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her, just kept staring out at the clouds like Jess was nothing more than a breeze passing through. Jess swallowed hard, her throat dry as sandpaper, and set the tray down on the fold-out table with a shaky clatter. Water, ma'am," she mumbled, her voice a cracked whisper, stripped of the brass she'd wielded hours ago. Ruth's head turned slow, her eyes sliding up to meet Jess's, and the weight of that gaze hit like a freight train. It wasn't anger, wasn't triumph, just a quiet, piercing clarity that made Jess feel like a kid caught stealing from the cookie jar, only this time the stakes were her whole damn life. "Thank you," Ruth said, her southern drawl soft but firm, each syllable a hammer on Jess's fraying nerves. She reached for the glass, her gnarled fingers brushing the edge, and Jess flinched like she'd been burned. Ruth took a sip, then set it back down, her movements deliberate, a ritual of calm that mocked Jess's unraveling. "You're shaking," Ruth added, her voice low, almost gentle, but it landed like a slap. Jess's hands jerked back, the tray tipping slightly, and a splash of water hit the table. She cursed under her breath, grabbing a napkin to dab at it, her face burning as David's eyes flicked over, his brow arching in silent judgment. "I'm fine," Jess snapped, sharper than she meant, but the lie was flimsy and she knew it. She straightened, forcing her shoulders back, trying to claw back some shred of the control she'd lost. But the cabin was a mirror now, reflecting every crack in her armor. Sarah's soft gasp a row back, the way David's fingers tightened around his glass, the sideways glances from a businessman in 3B, they all saw her, not as the queen of first class, but as the bully who doused an old lady in coffee and screamed her into submission. Jess's chest tightened, a panic she hadn't felt since her days dodging her dad's belt, and she turned away from Ruth, her tray rattling as she moved down the aisle. The intercom crackled, Emily's voice piping through, timid but steady, "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be serving refreshments shortly. Please let us know if you need anything." It was a lifeline, a chance for Jess to hide in routine, but it didn't last. A hand shot up from 4A, a middle-aged guy in a pinstripe suit, his Rolex glinting as he waved her over. "Hey sweetheart," he drawled, his voice loud enough to carry, "you gonna throw that scotch at me too, or can I trust you this time?" The cabin erupted in stifled laughs, a few snorts breaking the tension, and Jess's face went crimson. She forced a thin smile, setting the glass down with a clink, but her hands shook so bad the ice rattled and the guy grinned wider. "Easy there, champ. Don't spill it like you did on Granny up front." Jess's vision blurred, a hot sting behind her eyes she couldn't blink away. She mumbled something, maybe "enjoy your drink," and bolted for the galley, the tray slamming onto the counter as she ducked behind the curtain. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts, her hands gripping the edge of the sink as she stared at her reflection in the tiny mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the Jess Harper she'd built, tough, in charge, untouchable. This was a mess: smeared mascara, coffee-splattered uniform, a badge that felt like a lie. She'd spent 15 years making sure nobody could touch her, nobody could see the scared kid from Ohio who'd clawed her way out of nothing. And now she was the punchline, the villain, the one they'd all remember for the wrong reasons. The curtain rustled and Emily slipped in, her young face pale, her hands twisting nervously. "Jess, you okay?" she asked, her voice small like she was afraid of the answer. Jess spun on her, eyes wild. "Okay? Do I look okay, Em? That old bat's got everyone eating out of her hand, and I'm the one getting laughed at." Her voice cracked, a raw edge cutting through the galley's hum. Emily flinched, stepping back. "She didn't do anything, Jess, you did. You saw her ticket. Why didn't you just let her through?" The question hit like a gut punch and Jess's hands balled into fists. "Because she didn't belong," she hissed, her voice low and fierce, clinging to the lie that had fueled her meltdown. "You saw her, Rags Kane, acting like she's somebody. I know her type, leeches, freeloaders thinking they can sneak into my world." Emily's eyes widened, a flicker of pity crossing her face, and that was worse than the laughs. "Your world?" she echoed, soft but pointed. "Jess, it's a plane, not a throne. And she's not nobody." Marcus knew her. "Didn't you see how he looked at her?" Jess froze, the memory of Marcus's voice. "Mrs. Jackson, your seat's ready," slamming back like a brick through a window. The respect in his tone, the way he'd brushed her aside like she was nothing. Her stomach twisted, a cold dread creeping up her spine. "What's that supposed to mean?" she snapped, but her bravado was thinning, her hands trembling as she gripped the counter harder. Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know, but Jess, you messed with the wrong person. You felt it, didn't you? Back at the gate." Before Jess could answer, the intercom buzzed again, this time the captain's voice, smooth and clipped. "Flight crew, report to the cockpit immediately." Jess's heart stopped, her breath catching as Emily's eyes darted to hers. "That's for you," Emily whispered, stepping back like she didn't want to be caught in the blast radius. Jess's legs felt like lead, but she forced them to move, brushing past Emily and out into the aisle, every step a march toward judgment. The cockpit door loomed ahead, and when she stepped inside, the air was suffocating. Captain Daniel Hayes sat at the controls, his gray hair catching the dim light, his hands steady but his eyes sharp as knives. Beside him on the in-flight screen was Victor Ramsey, the airline COO, his face a mask of cold fury framed by a crisp suit and tie. Marcus Tate stood to the side, arms crossed, his presence a wall of quiet wrath. Jess's mouth went dry, her pulse hammering as she stood there, coffee stains and all, facing the men who held her career in their hands. "Miss Harper," Victor's voice cut through the speakers, smooth but icy, "explain why I'm getting passenger complaints about you before we've even hit cruising altitude." Jess swallowed, her voice barely a croak. "Sir, I had a situation at the gate. A passenger, Daniel interrupted, his tone flat but brutal. "You mean Mrs. Jackson? The woman you assaulted in front of a terminal full of people?" Jess's knees buckled, but she caught herself against the wall. "Assaulted? I didn't, I was just." Marcus stepped forward, his voice a low growl. "You threw coffee on her, Jess. You screamed at her like a damn lunatic. Don't play dumb, we've got video." Passengers sent it to corporate before the door even closed. Jess's stomach dropped, the cockpit spinning as the words sank in. Video. Her meltdown, immortalized, spreading like wildfire. Victor leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing. "Do you have any idea who she is?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Jess's mind raced, grasping for an answer, but all she could see was Ruth's face, those eyes that calm, the way Marcus had bowed to her. She's just some old lady," she stammered, but it sounded weak, a plea more than a defense. Victor's lips pressed into a thin line, and Daniel shook his head, rubbing his temple like he was fighting a headache. "Ruth Jackson," Victor said, slow and deliberate, "is the founder of this airline. The woman who built it from scratch. And you just turned her into a punching bag on a live stream." The words hit like a sledgehammer, knocking the air from Jess's lungs. "Founder. The founder." Her knees gave out this time and she slumped against the wall, her hands clawing at her uniform as the cockpit blurred around her. Ruth Jackson wasn't just some nobody, she was the reason Jess had a job, the name behind every plane she'd ever worked on. And Jess had soaked her in coffee, cursed her out, made her a spectacle. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice breaking, a child's excuse in a grown woman's mess. Marcus's eyes darkened, his voice cutting through her panic. "You didn't need to know, Jess. You saw a ticket, you saw a passenger, and you chose to be a monster instead of a professional." Victor nodded, his tone final. "You'll go back out there, Harper. You'll apologize, to her, to every passenger who saw it, in front of the whole damn cabin. And then you'll serve her like she's the queen she is. If you don't, you're off this plane in a uniform bag when we land." Jess's chest heaved, tears spilling now, hot and silent down her cheeks. She nodded, barely, her pride a pile of ash at her feet. She stumbled out of the cockpit, the door clicking shut behind her, and faced the aisle again. Ruth sat there, still calm, still watching the clouds, but now Jess saw her, really saw her, for the first time. And as she took a shaky step forward, the weight of her own wings crashed down, heavier than she'd ever imagined. The cabin of the Boeing 737 was a cocoon of artificial calm, its soft hum a deceptive lullaby over the turbulence brewing within. At 35,000 feet, the world below was a distant blur of patchwork fields and snaking rivers, but inside, time stretched thin, every second heavy with the unspoken. Ruth Jackson sat in 1A, her small frame cradled by the wide leather seat, the blanket draped over her shoulders a quiet shield against the coffee-soaked memory of the gate. Her cane leaned against the armrest, its worn knob glinting faintly, and her hands rested in her lap, fingers tracing the fabric's edge with a rhythm born of decades of endurance. She gazed out the window, her dark eyes catching the golden edge of the horizon, a serenity settling over her like a second skin. She'd seen storms, real ones, human ones, and this one, this messy little squall with Jess Harper, was just another ripple in a life that had weathered hurricanes. Across the aisle, David Brooks swirled his bourbon, the ice clinking softly as he stared at the seat back ahead, his mind a tangle of the gate's chaos and Ruth's unshakable calm. Sarah Coleman sat a row behind, her toddler dozing against her chest, her own hands steady now but her heart still racing from the raw ugliness she'd witnessed. The other passengers, businessmen in crisp shirts, a couple flipping through a glossy travel mag, kept their eyes low, but their ears were sharp, tuned to the undercurrent of tension that pulsed through first class. They'd seen Jess's meltdown on video loops by now, whispered about it over their drinks, and waited for the next act in this airborne drama. Jess Harper emerged from the galley like a soldier stepping into no man's land, her uniform a wrinkled mess, coffee stains faded but still accusing. Her blonde hair hung in limp strands, her bun a lost cause, and her badge dangled loose, a tarnished relic of the power she'd wielded like a club. She carried no tray this time, just herself, raw and exposed, her hands clenched at her sides as she forced her legs down the aisle. Marcus's orders, Victor's ultimatum, echoed in her skull: apologize publicly or lose everything. Her chest burned with a mix of dread and defiance, her throat tight with the tears she'd choked back in the cockpit. She'd spent 15 years building this life, first class, respect, a paycheck that kept the ghosts of Ohio at bay, and now it was slipping through her fingers, all because of an old woman she'd pegged as nothing. She stopped at Ruth's seat, her shadow falling across the blanket, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Ruth didn't look up, didn't flinch, just kept watching the clouds, her calm a wall Jess couldn't climb. Jess's mouth opened, then closed, her voice a strangled knot she couldn't untie. "Mrs. Jackson," she finally croaked, the name tasting foreign, heavy with the truth she'd been handed in the cockpit. Ruth's head turned slow, her eyes lifting to meet Jess's, and that gaze, deep, steady, unrelenting, stripped her bare. It wasn't pity, wasn't scorn. It was a mirror reflecting every ugly choice Jess had made in vivid, unforgiving detail. I need to say something," Jess stammered, her voice cracking like thin ice, loud enough for the cabin to hear. David's head snapped up, his bourbon pausing mid-swirl. Sarah shifted, her toddler stirring as she leaned forward, eyes wide. Jess swallowed, her hands twisting together, nails digging into her palms. "What I did at the gate, it was wrong. I judged you and I shouldn't have. I said things, did things." Her voice broke, a sob clawing up her throat, but she choked it down, forcing the words out. "I'm sorry. To you, to everyone who saw it. It was unprofessional and she faltered, the weight of the cabin stairs pressing in, a jury of strangers she'd turned against her. Ruth studied her, silent, her face a canvas of lines and wisdom that Jess couldn't read. The pause stretched, taut and suffocating until Ruth spoke, her voice low and rich, a river cutting through stone. What are you sorry for exactly? The question was simple, but it landed like a grenade, blasting through Jess's shaky defenses. The cabin tilted, or maybe it was just her, every eye boring into her, waiting for an answer she didn't have ready. David's brow furrowed, Sarah's breath hitched, and even the businessman in 3B put down his magazine, leaning in. Jess blinked, her mind scrambling, grasping for something safe, something rehearsed. I shouldn't have spilled the coffee, shouldn't have yelled, she said, but it sounded hollow, a script she'd memorized to save her skin. Ruth's eyes narrowed, just a fraction, and Jess felt the ground shift beneath her. That's what you're sorry for? Ruth pressed, her tone gentle but unyielding, a teacher coaxing a student toward a truth they didn't want to face. The coffee? The noise. Jess's chest tightened, her breath shallow as the real question sank in, not what she'd done but why. Jess's voice cracked again, her hands trembling as she forced herself to meet Ruth's gaze. The words stuck, jagged and raw, but Ruth's eyes wouldn't let her hide. I thought you didn't belong, she admitted, quieter now, the confession spilling out like blood from a fresh cut. I looked at you, your clothes, your cane, and I decided you weren't good enough. I didn't even check, not really. I just assumed. The cabin was silent, the hum of the engines the only sound as her words hung there, naked and ugly, a truth she'd buried under years of pride and bitterness. Ruth nodded once, slow and deliberate, her face still unreadable. And now, she asked, her voice a soft prod, pushing Jess deeper into the hole she'd dug. Jess's throat burned, her eyes stinging with tears she couldn't stop this time. Now I know I was wrong, she whispered, barely audible, but it carried to David, to Sarah, to every passenger who'd seen her unravel. You're more than I'll ever be. I didn't see it and I should've. The tears broke free, hot and silent down her cheeks, and she swiped at them with a shaking hand, her pride a crumpled heap at her feet. Ruth leaned back, her hands settling over the blanket, her gaze softening but not relenting. That's a start, she said, her tone even, a lifeline Jess didn't deserve but couldn't refuse. But knowing's not enough, girl. What you gonna do with it? The question hung there, a challenge wrapped in a chance, and Jess had no answer, not yet. She nodded, a jerky motion, and turned away, her legs unsteady as she stumbled back toward the galley, the cabin's eyes trailing her like spotlights on a fallen star. David watched her go, his bourbon forgotten, a mix of pity and unease twisting in his gut. He'd seen apologies before, corporate mea culpas polished and hollow, but this was different, messy, real, like watching someone peel back their own skin. Sarah hugged her toddler closer, her own tears drying as she whispered, "Good," under her breath, a quiet verdict from a mother who'd felt Ruth's dignity in her bones. The businessman in 3B shook his head, muttering, "Damn," to no one, a reluctant respect settling over him. In the galley, Jess slumped against the counter, her breath ragged, her hands gripping the edge as the plane's hum filled the silence. Emily peeked in, her young face hesitant. "You did it," she said, soft but firm, a lifeline Jess didn't know she needed. Jess didn't look up, her voice a broken rasp. "Did I? Or did I just make it worse?" Emily stepped closer, her hands twisting together. "You said the truth, Jess. That's something. She made you say it." Jess's head snapped up, her eyes red and raw. "She didn't make me do anything, I had to or I'm out." But even as she said it, she felt the lie fraying, the weight of Ruth's question, "What you gonna do with it?" sinking deeper. The intercom buzzed, Captain Daniel Hayes's voice cutting through, "Cabin crew, prepare for descent in 20 minutes. Jess straightened, brushing at her uniform, her hands still shaking but her spine stiffening. She had to keep moving, had to face the rest of this flight, had to serve Ruth like Victor had ordered. She stepped back into the aisle, her eyes darting to 1A, and found Ruth watching her, not with judgment, not with victory, but with a quiet expectation that hit harder than any insult ever could. Jess approached, slower this time, her voice a whisper as she stopped at Ruth's seat. "Anything else you need, ma'am?" she asked, the words tasting like ash, but she meant them, maybe for the first time. Ruth tilted her head, her eyes searching Jess's face, peeling back layers Jess hadn't known were there. "You ever been wrong before?" she asked, her tone conversational but sharp, a blade wrapped in velvet. Jess froze, her breath catching. "Yeah," she said, hoarse, "but not like this." Ruth nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Then you're learning," she said and turned back to the window, dismissing Jess with a grace that felt like a gift and a curse. Jess stood there rooted, Ruth's words echoing in her skull. Learning. She'd spent her life running from mistakes, her dad's, her mom's, her own, building a wall of rules and control to keep them out. But Ruth had torn it down, not with anger, not with force, but with a question that made Jess see herself, really see, for the first time. She judged Ruth by her sweater, her cane, her skin, her age, and missed the woman who'd built an empire while Jess was still slinging hash browns in a diner. The shame wasn't just in the coffee, the yelling, it was in the why, the part of her that had looked at Ruth and seen weakness because it was easier than seeing strength. David caught her eye as she turned away, his gaze softer now, a nod of something like respect. Takes guts to say that out loud, he said low enough that only she heard. Jess didn't respond, couldn't, her throat was too tight, her chest too full. She moved past him, past Sarah's quiet stare, past the businessman's grunt of acknowledgement, and back to the galley where the mirror waited. This time she didn't flinch from the reflection, just stared, letting the tears dry, letting Ruth's words settle like stones in her gut. The plane tilted slightly, the descent beginning, and Jess braced herself against the counter, her hands steady for the first time in hours. She didn't know if she could fix this, didn't know if she deserved to, but Ruth had cracked something open, a door she couldn't close. Learning. It wasn't an answer, wasn't a cure, but it was a start, and as the clouds parted below, Jess felt the weight of it, heavy and real, a burden she'd carry long after the wheels touched down. The wheels of the Boeing 737 kissed the tarmac with a jolt, the cabin shuddering as it slowed, but the real turbulence was still brewing inside. The passengers unbuckled their belts, their murmurs a low buzz as they gathered their bags, but their eyes kept darting to the front, to Ruth Jackson, still seated in 1A, her blanket folded neatly over her lap, and to Jess Harper, hovering near the galley, her coffee-stained uniform a silent confession. The flight had landed, but the weight of what happened at 35,000 feet clung to the air like humidity before a storm. David Brooks slung his jacket over his shoulder, casting a last glance at Ruth, a flicker of admiration in his tired eyes. Sarah Coleman lifted her sleeping toddler, her lips pressed tight, her mind still replaying Jess's shaky apology. The other passengers filed out, some whispering, some staring, their phones already buzzing with the gate video they dissected over drinks. Jess stood frozen as the cabin emptied, her hands gripping the edge of the galley counter, her breath shallow and uneven. The descent had been a blur, serving Ruth water, avoiding her gaze, feeling the cabin's judgment like a spotlight she couldn't escape. Now the plane was silent, save for the faint creak of the jet bridge locking into place, and Jess knew what came next. Marcus Tate's shadow loomed in the doorway, his suit crisp despite the long flight, his dark eyes locking on her with a cold precision that made her stomach twist. "Harper," he said, his voice a low command, "conference room now. They're waiting." She nodded, jerky and mechanical, her legs moving before her mind caught up, following him down the aisle past Ruth, who didn't look up, just sat there, calm as ever, her cane resting like a scepter. The airport terminal was a sterile maze of glass and steel, its hum of activity a distant roar as Marcus led Jess through a side door into a windowless conference room. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of industrial cleaner and old coffee, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the long table. Victor Ramsey sat at the head, his suit jacket off, tie loosened, his face a mask of controlled fury as he scrolled through a tablet. Likely the passenger videos, Jess thought, her chest tightening. Captain Daniel Hayes leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his gray hair catching the light, his jaw set like he'd rather be anywhere else. A new face, Michael Carter, the airline's operations director, sat to Victor's right, his sharp features softened by a notepad he scribbled on, his eyes flicking up as Jess entered. Marcus took a seat beside him, his presence a quiet storm, and gestured for Jess to stand at the table's far end, alone. "Sit if you want," Victor said, his voice smooth but edged with steel, "but you're not here to get comfortable." Jess stayed standing, her hands clasped behind her back, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her face blank. The room was a courtroom and she was on trial. No lawyer, no jury, just the men who'd shaped her career and now held its ashes. Victor tapped the tablet, the screen glowing with a still of her at the gate, coffee cup in hand, mid-rant. 18 million views, he said, letting the number hang like a guillotine. 18 million people have seen you turn our airline into a circus. Explain yourself, Harper. And don't waste my time. Jess's throat burned, her voice a rasp as she forced it out. I made a mistake, sir. I misjudged a passenger, I overreacted and Victor cut her off, his hand slamming the table, the sound sharp enough to make her flinch. "A mistake?" he snapped, leaning forward, his eyes boring into her. "You didn't trip over a bag, Harper. You assaulted Ruth Jackson, the woman who built this company, in front of a terminal full of phones. You think mistake covers that?" Daniel shifted, his voice low but brutal. "You're lucky she didn't sue us on the spot. You'd be flipping burgers by now if she had." Jess's knees trembled, but she locked them, her hands clenching tighter. "I didn't know who she was," she said, the words spilling out, desperate and thin. I thought she was some nobody trying to sneak into first class. I was protecting the rules, the standards." Michael snorted, cutting her off, his pen tapping the notepad. "Standards? You mean your ego, Jess? You saw an old black lady with a cane and decided she didn't fit your little first-class fantasy. Don't dress it up as duty." His tone was dry, cutting, a lawyer dissecting a bad lie, and Jess's face flushed, her breath hitching as the truth landed like a slap. Marcus leaned forward, his voice a quiet thunder that silenced the room. "You had her ticket, Jess. You saw the scanner go green. You chose to ignore it because you couldn't stand the idea of being wrong." His eyes met hers, steady and unyielding, and Jess felt the weight of his disappointment, worse than Victor's anger, worse than Daniel's disdain. Marcus had trained her, pulled her up when she'd stumbled early on, and now she'd spit on that faith. "I said I was sorry," she choked out, her voice breaking, tears prickling her eyes. "I apologized. On the plane in front of everyone. What else do you want?" Victor's lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers drumming the tablet. "Sorry doesn't erase 18 million views, Harper. It doesn't fix the PR nightmare you've dumped on us. We're a laughingstock because you couldn't keep your damn hands to yourself." He paused, his gaze flicking to Marcus, then back to Jess. "But Ruth Jackson, she's the only reason you're still standing here. She asked us to hear you out. Not to forgive you, not to save you, just to listen. So talk." Jess blinked, the words sinking in slow, a lifeline she didn't understand. Ruth had asked for this? After the coffee, the insults, the humiliation, why? Her mind raced, grasping for something to say, something to salvage the wreckage. I know I screwed up," she started, her voice shaky but raw, the Ohio twang creeping in as her defenses crumbled. "I looked at her and saw everything I've spent my life running from: poverty, weakness, being invisible. I grew up with nothing, sir. Dad drank it all away, Mom begged for scraps, and I swore I'd never be that again. I thought she was less. And I hated her for it." The room went still, the buzz of the lights the only sound as her confession hung there, jagged and real. Daniel's arms uncrossed, his expression softening just a fraction. Michael's pen paused, his sharp eyes narrowing with a flicker of interest. Victor leaned back, his fury cooling into something harder to read. Marcus just watched, his face a mask, but his silence was louder than any reprimand. Jess's hands unclenched, trembling as she pressed them to the table, leaning in like she was pleading for her life. "I was wrong," she said, quieter now, the tears spilling free. "Not just about her ticket, her seat, about her. She's more than I'll ever be, and I couldn't see it, till she made me. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try." Victor tapped the tablet again, the screen going dark, and leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "You don't fix 18 million views, Harper. You live with it. You made your bed, now you're damn well gonna lie in it." He glanced at Michael, who nodded, scribbling something quick. 6 months probation, Victor continued, his tone final. "Mandatory retraining, bias, leadership, the works. One more screw-up and you're out. No appeal, no excuses. You're here because Ruth Jackson gave you a chance, not us." Jess's breath caught, a sob breaking loose as the words hit. Probation, not fired. A lifeline, thin and fraying but real. She nodded, her hands wiping at her face, smearing mascara across her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible, but it wasn't for Victor. It was for Ruth, wherever she was. Daniel pushed off the wall, his voice gruff but steady. "Don't thank us yet, kid. You've got a long road to prove you're worth it." Michael slid his notepad into his briefcase, his tone dry. "Start by figuring out why you saw less in her. That's your real punishment." Marcus stood, his chair scraping the floor, and gestured to the door. "We're done here," he said, his voice flat but heavy with expectation. Jess nodded again, her legs wobbling as she turned to leave, the room's silence pressing against her back. She stepped into the terminal, the hum of travelers a distant roar, and stopped, her breath ragged as the weight of the hearing settled in. Probation. Retraining. A chance she hadn't earned. Her hands shook as she brushed at her uniform, the coffee stains a permanent mark, a reminder of the fall she couldn't outrun. Outside the conference room, Ruth Jackson waited, her small frame perched on a bench near the gate, her cane resting across her knees. Marcus had told her the verdict, 6 months, a second chance, and she'd nodded, her face calm but her eyes sharp with a purpose Jess couldn't see. She'd watched the plane empty, seen David tip his head to her, Sarah offer a shy smile, and now she sat, waiting for the woman who'd tried to break her. When Jess emerged, their eyes met across the terminal, a silent thread pulling taut between them. Jess froze, her heart hammering as Ruth stood, slow and deliberate, her cane tapping the floor. She walked over, her steps steady, and stopped a few feet away, her gaze locking on Jess with that same piercing clarity from the plane. "They let you stay," Ruth said, her voice low, a statement not a question. Jess nodded, her throat tight. "Yeah, probation. Thanks to you." Ruth's lips curved, a faint smile that wasn't warm but wasn't cold either. "Don't thank me, girl. I didn't do it for you, I did it for them." She nodded toward the terminal, the passengers, the airline she'd built. "They deserve better than what you gave them today." Jess's chest ached, her hands twisting together as Ruth's words cut deep. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm trying, I will." Ruth studied her, her eyes narrowing like she was peeling back layers Jess didn't know she had. "Trying's a start," she said, her tone even, a teacher's patience with a slow student. "But it's not about me, it's about you. What you gonna do with that chance?" Jess had no answer, just a nod, her tears drying as the question sank in, heavier than the hearing's verdict. Ruth turned to go, her cane tapping a steady rhythm, but paused, glancing back. "I built this from nothing," she said, her voice a quiet thunder, "because I knew what it was to be less. You don't get to decide that for anybody else, ever again." She walked away, her small frame disappearing into the crowd, leaving Jess standing there, the terminals hum a distant echo against the storm in her head. Ruth's words were a brand, a challenge, a mirror Jess couldn't shatter, and as she watched her go, she felt the first real crack in the wall she'd built, a crack she couldn't close but maybe, just maybe, could grow through. The terminal at dusk was a restless beast, its glass walls glowing with the last amber streaks of sunset, its floors alive with the shuffle of travelers dragging suitcases and chasing gates. The hum of announcements crackled overhead, a steady pulse against the fading light, but for Jess Harper, it was all static, white noise drowning out the chaos in her head. She stood near the gate where the Boeing 737 had disgorged its passengers hours ago, her coffee-stained uniform swapped for a plain gray sweatshirt and jeans, her badge tucked away like a relic she wasn't ready to face. Her blonde hair hung loose, tangled and dull, framing a face still raw from tears and the weight of the disciplinary hearing. "Probation. 6 months. Retraining." The words looped in her skull, a lifeline she hadn't earned, a rope she didn't know how to climb. She'd slipped out of the conference room after Marcus's curt dismissal, avoiding the eyes of Victor Ramsey, Daniel Hayes and Michael Carter, their verdict a brand on her skin. The terminal had swallowed her then, a sea of strangers who didn't know her name but might have seen her face. 18 million views, Victor had said, a number that haunted her like a ghost she couldn't shake. She'd wandered aimless, past the coffee kiosk she couldn't stomach, past the newsstand's flashing headlines she didn't dare read, until she'd ended up here, back where it started, staring at the empty gate like it held answers she couldn't find. Across the concourse, Ruth Jackson sat on a bench near a departures board, her small frame dwarfed by the bustle around her. Her patched sweater was gone, replaced by a simple navy coat someone, maybe Emily, had scrounged up after the flight, but her cane rested across her knees, its worn handle a quiet testament to the miles she'd walked. Her headscarf was tied tight, a few silver strands glinting under the lights, and her dark eyes traced the flickering updates on the board, calm as ever, a woman who'd built an empire and carried it in her bones. She'd stayed after the hearing, not to gloat, not to watch Jess squirm, but to tie up loose ends, signing off on a report Marcus had handed her, nodding to a gate agent who'd whispered thanks for something Jess couldn't hear. Jess saw her from the corner of her eye, a jolt of recognition pulling her upright. Ruth hadn't left, hadn't disappeared into the ether like some avenging angel after the reckoning. She was here, flesh and blood, and Jess felt the pull, a magnetic tug she couldn't resist. Her legs moved before her mind caught up, carrying her across the concourse, her sneakers scuffing the linoleum as she closed the distance. She stopped a few feet away, her hands shoved deep in her pockets, her breath shallow as Ruth's head turned, those piercing eyes locking on her with a clarity that made Jess want to run and stay all at once. "Mrs. Jackson," Jess said, her voice a rasp, barely audible over the terminal's din. Ruth tilted her head, a faint nod the only invitation, and Jess took it, stepping closer, her hands twisting inside her pockets. I didn't think you'd still be here," she stammered, the words clumsy, a kid fumbling for something to say. Ruth's lips curved, a small, knowing smile that wasn't warm but wasn't cold either. "Had some business," she said, her southern drawl wrapping the words in a rhythm Jess couldn't escape. "You?" Jess swallowed, her throat dry, her eyes flicking to the floor then back to Ruth. "I don't know," she admitted, raw and honest, the first real thing she'd said all day. "Just figuring it out, I guess." Ruth nodded again, her cane tapping once against the bench, a quiet metronome in the chaos. "Good place to start," she said, her tone even, a teacher's patience with a student still fumbling through the lesson. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, and Jess shifted, her weight rocking between her heels. "They gave me 6 months," she blurted, the words spilling out like a confession she couldn't hold back. "Probation, retraining, said it was because of you." Ruth's eyes narrowed, just a fraction, but she didn't interrupt, letting Jess stumble through it. "I don't get it," Jess went on, her voice cracking. "Why you do that? Ask them to hear me out. After everything I did, I figured you'd want me gone." Ruth leaned back, her hands resting over her cane, her gaze steady as it peeled back Jess's layers. "You think I did it for you?" she asked, her voice low but sharp, a blade cutting through the noise. Jess blinked, caught off guard, her hands clenching in her pockets. I don't know," she said, faltering. "I thought maybe." Ruth shook her head, slow and deliberate, her smile fading. "I did it for them," she said, nodding toward the terminal, the gates, the planes humming in the distance. "This airline, these people, they're mine. I built them from dirt, and I don't let them fall because one person forgets what they're for." Jess's chest tightened, Ruth's words a punch she hadn't seen coming. Not for her. For the empire, the legacy, the thing Ruth had poured her life into while Jess was still kicking rocks in Ohio. "So I'm just, what? A loose end?" she asked, her voice trembling, a mix of hurt and defiance creeping in. Ruth's eyes softened, but her tone stayed firm. "You're a chance," she said, simple and direct, "a chance to be better than you were. I didn't save you, girl, I gave you room to save yourself. What you do with it's on you." The words hit like a brick, heavy and real, and Jess's breath caught, her eyes stinging with tears she didn't want to shed. She'd spent the flight, the hearing, the hours since wrestling with shame, with the why of her meltdown, but this was a door cracked open, a sliver of light she didn't know how to reach. "I don't know if I can," she whispered, the admission raw, a crack in the armor she'd worn too long. "I've been running from nothing my whole life. Poverty, being nobody. I thought I'd beat it, but I turned into something worse." Ruth studied her, her face a map of lines and wisdom, and for a moment, Jess thought she saw a flicker of recognition. Something shared, something understood. "Running's easy," Ruth said, her voice low, a river carving through stone. "Stopping's hard. I ran too, ran from a shack with no heat, from folks who said I'd never be more than a maid. But I didn't build this by running, I built it by standing still, looking at what I didn't want to see and fixing it. You want to change? Stop running. Look." Jess's hands slipped from her pockets, trembling as they hung at her sides, Ruth's words sinking deep, rooting her to the spot. She'd spent years not looking, at her dad's empty bottles, her mom's hunched shoulders, the kid she'd been who'd sworn she'd never bend. She'd looked at Ruth and seen a shadow of that past, a threat to the life she'd clawed out, and she'd lashed out to keep it buried. "How?" she asked, her voice small, a plea more than a question. "How do I look at that and not break?" Ruth's smile returned, faint but real, a spark of something like faith. "You already broke," she said, her tone gentle but unyielding. "That's why you're here talking to me. Breaking's not the end, it's the start. You pick up the pieces, you figure out what fits, and you build something new. Ain't nobody gonna do it for you." She tapped her cane once more, a punctuation mark, and Jess felt it, a shift, a crack in the concrete she'd poured over her past, letting air in for the first time. The terminal's hum swelled around them, a family rushing past with a crying kid, a businessman barking into his phone, but Jess didn't hear it. She stood there rooted, Ruth's words echoing in her skull, "Breaking's not the end, it's the start." She'd broken at the gate, in the cockpit, in the hearing, and now, standing here, She felt the pieces shifting, jagged and sharp, but hers to hold. "I want to try," she said, her voice steadier now, a vow she wasn't sure she could keep but needed to say. "I don't know how, but I want to try." Ruth nodded, slow and deliberate, her eyes searching Jess's face like she was measuring the weight of that promise. "That's enough for now," she said, her tone a quiet thunder, a lifeline Jess could feel but not yet grasp. She stood, her cane tapping the floor as she adjusted her coat, her small frame rising with a dignity that filled the space. "I'm leaving," she said, nodding toward the departures board. "Got a meeting in Dallas tomorrow." "You're staying. Make it mean something." She paused, her gaze locking on Jess one last time, and handed her a folded piece of paper. Nothing fancy, just a note scrawled in steady cursive. "Make it mean something." Jess took it, her fingers trembling as she clutched the paper. Ruth's words a brand she couldn't shake. "I will," she whispered, barely audible, but Ruth heard it, she always did. The old woman turned, her cane tapping a steady rhythm as she moved toward the gate, her navy coat a quiet banner in the crowd. Jess watched her go, her breath hitching as Ruth disappeared into the sea of travelers, a titan slipping back into the world she'd built, leaving Jess with a chance she didn't deserve but couldn't refuse. She unfolded the note, staring at the words, "Make it mean something," and felt the weight settle, heavy but alive, a seed planted in the crack she'd let Ruth pry open. The terminal pulsed around her, a mother scolding her kid, a janitor pushing a broom, life moving on while Jess stood still, the paper trembling in her hands. She'd spent her life running, from the trailer park, from the shame, from the girl who'd sworn she'd be more, and it had turned her into this. A woman who'd hurt someone to feel big, who'd lost herself in the fight to never lose again. But Ruth had stopped her, not with anger, not with punishment, but with a mirror and a chance, and now Jess had to decide what to build from the wreckage. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from Emily, simple and blunt. "You okay?" Jess stared at it, her thumb hovering, then typed back, "Not yet. But I will be." She hit send, the words a promise to herself as much as to Emily, a first step on a road she couldn't see but had to walk. The terminal lights flickered overhead, the sunset bleeding out beyond the glass, and Jess tucked the note into her pocket, her hands steady for the first time in days. She didn't know what came next, retraining, probation, the 18 million eyes that'd never forget, but she knew she couldn't run anymore. Not from Ruth, not from herself. Across the concourse, Marcus Tate watched from a distance, his arms crossed, his face a mask of quiet observation. He'd seen Ruth hand Jess the note, seen the shift in her stance, and nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of something starting, something small but real. He turned away, disappearing into the crowd, trusting Ruth's judgment as he always had. Jess didn't see him, she didn't need to. The note was enough, Ruth's voice echoing in her head, a call to build something new from the pieces she'd broken, a second chance she'd have to earn one day at a time. The departures board clicked, a new flight flashing up, and Jess took a breath, deep and slow, the terminal's hum fading into a rhythm she could finally hear. She turned from the gate, her sneakers scuffing the floor, and walked toward the exit, the note a weight in her pocket, a crack in the concrete letting light in, a start she couldn't undo. The airport terminal at night was a cathedral of motion, its vast ceilings arching over a congregation of travelers, some sprinting to gates, others slumped in chairs, all bound by the hum of departure boards and the faint whine of jet engines beyond the glass. The fluorescent lights buzzed a steady hymn, casting long shadows across the linoleum, and the air carried the mingled scents of stale coffee, sanitizer, and the promise of somewhere else. Jess Harper stood near the exit, her gray sweatshirt a muted shield against the chill seeping through the doors, her hands deep in her pockets, clutching Ruth Jackson's note like a talisman. "Make it mean something." The words burned in her mind, a quiet fire that had followed her from the gate, through the flight, past the hearing, and now into this liminal space where the day's wreckage settled into something she could feel but not yet name. She'd walked away from Ruth hours ago, watched her vanish into the crowd with that steady tap of her cane, a titan in a navy coat who'd handed Jess a second chance she hadn't earned. The terminal was quieter now, the rush of the evening flights thinning to a trickle, but Jess couldn't leave, not yet. She lingered, her sneakers rooted to the floor, her eyes tracing the paths of strangers as her mind replayed the day, the coffee splashing across Ruth's sweater, the venom in her own voice, the 18 million views that had turned her into a cautionary tale. It wasn't just shame that kept her here, it was the weight of what she'd learned, the echo of Ruth's question cutting through the noise. "What you gonna do with it?" Across the city, Ruth Jackson sat in a Dallas hotel room, her cane propped against the desk, her coat draped over a chair. The skyline glittered beyond the window, A sprawl of lights she'd helped shape with every plane she'd put in the sky. She'd signed off on her meeting notes, expansion plans, a new route, and now she sipped tea from a chipped mug, her hands steady, her mind drifting back to Jess. Not out of pity, not out of pride, but out of recognition. A spark of the girl she'd been, scrappy and scared, running from nothing until she'd learned to stand still. Ruth didn't need Jess to thank her, didn't need her to succeed. She'd given her the chance because that's what she'd built this airline for. A ladder up, not a gate to lock people out. Back at the terminal, Jess pulled the note from her pocket, unfolding it under the harsh light. Make it mean something. She traced the cursive with her thumb, the paper creased from her grip, and felt the day's lessons settle into her bones. It wasn't about the coffee, the yelling, the probation. Those were symptoms, not the disease. It was about the why, the part of her that had looked at Ruth and seen a threat, a shadow of the weakness she'd spent her life outrunning. Jess had grown up in a trailer park where the wind whistled through cracked windows, where her dad's empty bottles rolled under the couch, where her mom's prayers were drowned by the TV's static. She'd vowed to be more than the shame, more than the nothing, and she'd built a life on that vow, a first-class shield of rules and pride. But Ruth had cracked it open, not with force, but with a truth Jess couldn't dodge. Power isn't in keeping others down, it's in lifting yourself up without stepping on anyone else. She thought of David Brooks, his bourbon-swirling silence on the plane, the nod he'd given her after her apology, a flicker of respect she hadn't expected. Sarah Coleman, clutching her kid, her quiet good, a verdict that stung and soothed. Emily texting her, "You okay?" A lifeline from someone who'd seen her at her worst and still cared. They'd all been part of it, witnesses to her fall and her first shaky step back, and Jess felt their eyes still, not as judges now, but as mirrors reflecting a woman she could become if she tried. The terminal's hum faded, her breath steadying as she folded the note and tucked it back into her pocket. A promise she'd carry like a stone she couldn't drop. Ruth's face flickered in her mind, those deep eyes, that calm, the way she'd stood unbowed under the coffee, the insults, the chaos. Jess had seen her as less, a relic in a patched sweater, because it was easier than seeing more strength, more grit, more worth than Jess had ever scraped together in her 15 years of climbing. Ruth had built an airline from a single plane, a dream laughed off by men who didn't see her, and she'd done it without tearing anyone down. Jess had torn Ruth down, or tried to, and the shame of that wasn't in the video, the hearing, the probation. It was in the realization that she'd been running from her own weakness by pinning it on someone else, and Ruth had shown her what strength really looked like: quiet, steady, unapologetic. The terminal doors slid open, a cold gust sweeping in, and Jess stepped closer, her reflection ghosting across the glass. She didn't recognize the woman staring back, not the Jess Harper who'd ruled first class like a queen, not the kid who'd hid from her dad's rages, but someone new, someone cracked and fragile but alive. Ruth's words rang again, "Breaking's not the end, it's the start," and Jess felt it, a shift in the concrete she'd poured over her past, a sprout pushing through the rubble. She'd broken at the gate, in the air, in that room with Victor's cold stare, and now the pieces were hers to pick up, to shape into something that meant more than pride, more than control. Marcus Tate's shadow crossed her mind, his quiet nod at the gate, his trust in Ruth's judgment a thread tying this mess to something bigger. Victor's voice, "You're here because of her," and Daniel's gruff, "Prove you're worth it," Michael's dry, "Figure out why." They'd all seen her fall, seen her claw at a second chance, and left her with a challenge she couldn't ignore. The airline wasn't just planes and routes, it was Ruth's blood, her sweat, her defiance against a world that had told her no, and Jess had nearly stained it with her own petty rage. But Ruth hadn't let her, not fully. She'd given her room to stand, to try, and Jess felt the weight of that gift, heavy and humbling, a debt she'd repay not with words but with what she did next. A janitor pushed a broom nearby, the bristles whispering against the floor, and Jess watched him, his hands steady, his head low, a man doing his job, invisible to the crowd. She'd been him once, slinging hash browns in a diner, wiping tables while truckers barked orders, saving every dime to escape. She'd thought escape meant rising above, looking down, but Ruth had shown her it was sideways, standing with, not over. The janitor glanced up, caught her eye, and nodded, a small gesture that hit her like a brick. She nodded back, her throat tight, and turned toward the exit, the cold air biting her cheeks as she stepped outside. The parking lot stretched dark and quiet, the planes a distant roar overhead, and Jess stopped, her breath fogging in the night. She pulled the note out again, holding it under a street lamp, the cursive glowing soft against the shadows. Make it mean something. It wasn't forgiveness. Ruth hadn't offered that, hadn't needed to. It was a charge, a call to build something from the ashes Jess had made, to prove she could be more than the woman who'd lashed out, more than the kid who'd run. She thought of her mom hunched over a sink, her dad, passed out on the couch, ghosts she'd carried too long, ghosts she'd pinned on Ruth to keep them at bay. But they were hers, not Ruth's, and letting them go meant facing them, not fighting them in someone else. Her phone buzzed. Emily again, heading home. You. Jess typed back, her fingers steady. Soon. Got some thinking to do. She hit send, pocketed the phone, and looked up at the sky, the planes cutting through the dark like stars she couldn't touch. Ruth was up there somewhere, flying to Dallas, her legacy a net Jess had fallen through and been caught by. The old woman didn't need Jess to succeed, didn't need her at all, but she'd given her a shot anyway, not because Jess deserved it, but because Ruth believed in the possibility of more. And that belief, that quiet, stubborn faith, was the real power, the kind Jess had chased in all the wrong ways. She started walking, her sneakers crunching gravel, the terminal fading behind her. The probation loomed, 6 months, retraining, a chance to prove she wasn't the woman in that video, but it wasn't about the job anymore. It was about the why, the part of her that had judged Ruth by her sweater, her cane, her skin, and missed the titan underneath. It was about the people she'd dismissed, passengers, co-workers, the janitor with his broom, because they didn't fit her narrow frame of worth. Ruth had built something that carried them all, and Jess had tried to gatekeep it, not realizing she was locking herself out too. The night stretched wide, the city lights a faint glow ahead, and Jess felt the echo of Ruth's lesson settle deep, a truth she couldn't unlearn, a call she couldn't ignore. Power wasn't in the badge, the uniform, the first-class line, it was in the standing still, the looking, the building up without tearing down. She'd spent her life running from nothing, fighting to be seen, but Ruth had shown her that being seen wasn't the point, seeing was. Seeing the janitor, the kid with the tired mom, the old woman with the cane, and knowing they mattered not because of what they wore or what they owned, but because they were there, breathing the same air, walking the same ground. Jess stopped at the edge of the lot, the wind tugging at her sweatshirt, and looked back at the terminal one last time. The planes roared overhead, Ruth's planes, carrying stories she'd never know, and Jess felt small, not weak, not less, but small in a way that made room for more. She'd broken, and Ruth had let her, not to punish her, but to free her, to give her a chance to build something new. Make it mean something. The note stayed in her pocket, a weight she'd carry into tomorrow, into the retraining, into the days she couldn't see but had to face. She turned away, her steps steady now, the city lights calling her home. The echo of Ruth's voice lingered, "You don't get to decide that for anybody else," and Jess nodded to the dark, a silent vow to the woman who'd changed her, to the kid she'd been, to the strangers she'd meet. It wasn't over, not the shame, not the fight, but it was a start, a crack in the concrete letting roots grow, a meaning she'd make one shaky step at a time. The city sprawled beyond the airport, a jagged skyline of steel and glass cutting into the night, its lights flickering like a heartbeat Jess Harper could feel but not quite match. She stood at the edge of the parking lot, the cold biting through her gray sweatshirt, her breath fogging in the crisp March air. The terminal loomed behind her, a monolith of glass and noise she'd escaped but couldn't erase, its hum a fading echo as she clutched Ruth Jackson's note in her pocket. Make it mean something. The words were a compass now, not just a challenge, a north star she'd ignored too long, chasing shadows instead of light. Her sneakers crunched gravel as she took her first steps toward the bus stop, the planes roaring overhead a reminder of the world she'd nearly lost, a world she had to rebuild from the ground up. The ride home was a blur of sodium-lit streets and rattling windows, the bus half-empty save for a tired nurse in scrubs and a kid with headphones too big for his head. Jess slumped against the seat, her reflection ghosting across the glass, pale, hollowed out, a stranger she'd made and unmade in a single day. The coffee stains were gone, washed away with the uniform she'd shed, but the weight of them lingered, a phantom burn on her skin. She pulled out her phone, the screen lighting up with notifications she couldn't face, texts from Emily, a missed call from her mom, a news alert with her name in the headline. Flight attendant's meltdown goes viral. 18 million views and counting. She swiped it away, her thumb trembling, and tucked the phone back, letting the note's edge press against her palm instead. Her apartment was a shoebox on the edge of town, a fifth-floor walk-up with peeling paint and a view of a brick wall. She fumbled with the keys, the lock sticking as always, and stepped into the dim quiet, the air stale with yesterday's takeout and the faint hum of a fridge that rattled too loud. She didn't turn on the lights, just kicked off her shoes, dropped her bag and sank onto the couch, the springs creaking under her weight. The note came out again, unfolded on the coffee table, its cursive stark against the chipped wood. Make it mean something. Jess stared at it, her hands resting on her knees, her breath shallow as the day's echoes crashed in. Ruth's calm under the coffee, Marcus's cold command, Victor's verdict, her own cracked voice on the plane. She'd broken, and Ruth had let her, not to destroy her, but to show her the pieces she'd ignored too long. The clock ticked past midnight, the city's pulse a distant thrum through the walls, and Jess's mind drifted to the girl she'd been, skinny knees, tangled hair, hiding in a closet while her dad raged outside. She'd sworn she'd never be weak, never be small, and she'd built a life on that swear. First class, a badge, a wall of rules to keep the world at bay. But Ruth had walked through it, small and steady, her cane tapping a truth Jess couldn't dodge. Strength wasn't in the wall, wasn't in the gatekeeping. It was in the standing, the seeing, the letting go of the ghost she'd carried too long. Jess's hands clenched, her nails digging into her palms, and she felt the first real tear fall. Not shame, not panic, but a release, a crack widening to let something new in. Meanwhile, in Dallas, Ruth Jackson sat at a hotel window, the city's glow a quiet companion to her thoughts. Her navy coat hung on the door, her cane rested against the chair, and a stack of papers sat on the desk. Expansion plans, a new hub, the next chapter of the airline she'd birthed from nothing. She sipped tea, the mug warm against her palms, her dark eyes tracing the skyline she'd helped shape. The day replayed in fragments. Jess's wild rage at the gate, the coffee soaking her sweater, the girl's shaky apology on the plane, her raw plea in the terminal. Ruth didn't smile, didn't sigh, just sat there, steady as ever, a woman who'd seen enough storms to know this one was small, but enough to matter. She'd built the airline from a single prop plane, a dream forged in an Alabama shack where the roof leaked and the winters bit deep. Men had laughed, banks had turned her away, but she'd kept going, cleaning floors by night, saving every penny, pitching her vision until one fool said yes. That fool was long gone, but Ruth was here, her name on every jet, her legacy in every takeoff. Jess Harper was a blip, a pebble in the road, but Ruth had paused for her, not out of kindness, not out of pity, but because she'd seen herself in the girl's fight, the scrappy kid who'd run until she couldn't. Ruth had stopped running decades ago, built something instead, and Jess was her mirror now, a chance to see if the lesson stuck. Back in her apartment, Jess stood, the note still on the table, and moved to the kitchen, flicking on the light. The fridge rattled, the sink dripped, and she grabbed a glass of water, her hand steadier now. She leaned against the counter, staring at the chipped tile, and thought of Emily. You okay? A text she'd answered with a promise. Not yet. But I will be. It wasn't a lie, not anymore. She'd meant it, felt it, a spark of something she hadn't touched since the diner days, when every tip was a step out, a hope she'd buried under pride and control. Ruth had dug it up, not with words but with that damn note, that quiet faith Jess couldn't shake. The next morning came gray and cold, the city waking slow under a blanket of clouds. Jess pulled on a jacket, the note tucked in her pocket, and headed out, her breath fogging as she walked the 6 blocks to a coffee shop she hadn't hit in years. Not the airport kiosks, not the first-class trays, but a hole in the wall with cracked vinyl booths and a bell that jingled too loud. She slid into a seat by the window, ordered black coffee, ironic she thought, but it fit, and watched the world roll by. A mom pushing a stroller, a guy in a delivery vest, lives she'd never noticed before. The coffee came, steaming and bitter, and Jess sipped it slow, her hands wrapping the mug, her mind tracing the road ahead. Probation started Monday, 6 months, retraining, a gauntlet of bias workshops and leadership drills she'd once scoffed at. She'd face it though, not for Victor, not for Marcus, but for herself, for the woman she'd glimpsed in Ruth's mirror, the one who could be more than a viral meltdown. She pulled out her phone, scrolled past the news alerts, and texted Emily, "Coffee later? Need to talk." The reply came fast, "Hell yes." 6 p.m.? And Jess smiled, small but real, a tether to something solid. She'd tell her about the note, the hearing, the crack Ruth had pried open, and maybe Emily would get it, maybe she'd help Jess hold the pieces. In Dallas, Ruth boarded a morning flight, her cane tapping the jet bridge, her navy coat a quiet banner as she settled into 1A, always 1A, her seat, her claim. The attendant, a young guy with nervous hands, offered her water, and she nodded, her smile faint but warm. "Thank you, son," she said, her drawl a comfort he didn't expect, and he smiled back, steadier now. The plane taxied, the engines roaring to life, and Ruth gazed out at the tarmac, her mind drifting not to Jess, but to the next stop, Chicago, a board meeting, another piece of the empire she'd built. Jess was a footnote, a ripple, but Ruth felt her anyway, a thread in the tapestry she'd woven from nothing, a hope she'd planted without needing to see it grow. Jess finished her coffee, the mug empty, the warmth lingering in her hands. She left a tip, more than she used to, a nod to the waitress who'd nodded back, and stepped outside, the wind sharp against her cheeks. The city stretched wide, a maze of chances she hadn't seen before, and she walked into it, her sneakers steady, the note a weight she'd carry. She thought of David Brooks, his quiet respect on the plane, Sarah Coleman's soft verdict, the janitor's nod, faces she'd missed in her rush to rise, faces she'd see now not as threats, but as part of the ground she'd stand on. The retraining would be brutal, hours of lectures, role-plays, questions she'd have to answer about the why, the bias, the rage she'd let spill. She'd face it though not because she had to but because she wanted to know the Jess who could look at Ruth and see strength, not weakness, who could serve a plane full of strangers and mean it. The 18 million views would fade, the headlines would shift, but the note wouldn't, make it mean something, and Jess felt it, a call to build, not break, to rise, not run. Ruth's plane climbed, the clouds swallowing Dallas. And she closed her eyes, the hum of the engines a lullaby she'd written herself. She didn't think of Jess long, didn't need to. The girl was on her own now, a seed in the wind, and Ruth had done her part, not out of mercy, but out of faith in the dirt she'd come from, the dirt that grew things when you let it. She'd built an airline for the invisible, people like her, like Jess, like the attendant with the nervous hands, and she'd keep building, her cane tapping the path, her legacy a sky that carried them all. Jess reached her building, the stairs creaking under her weight, and paused at the door, her key in hand. The city buzzed below, a chorus of lives she'd ignored too long, and she felt them now, felt Ruth in them, felt herself in them. She'd fallen hard, broken loud, but the road ahead was hers, not to escape but to walk, to see, to make something that mattered. She turned the key, the lock clicking open, and stepped inside, the note a quiet promise in her pocket, a start she'd chase one day, one stranger, one truth at a time. The planes roared on, the terminal hummed, and somewhere between the sky and the ground Jess Harper took her first real breath, the kind that felt like beginning. The training room smelled of burnt coffee and cheap carpet cleaner, a windowless box tucked in the back of the airline's regional office, its walls lined with faded posters of smiling flight attendants and safety protocols no one read. Jess Harper sat at a folding table, her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup she hadn't touched, her gray hoodie swapped for a stiff navy polo with the airline's logo. A uniform she'd once worn with pride, now a grudging necessity. 3 months into her 6-month probation, and the retraining sessions had become a gauntlet, hours of lectures on bias, role-plays that made her squirm, and questions that peeled back layers she'd spent years burying. The instructor, a wiry guy named Tom with a clipboard and a permanent frown, paced at the front, his voice a drone as he clicked through slides. Implicit bias, recognizing the unseen. Jess's eyes glazed over, her mind drifting to the note in her pocket. Make it mean something. Ruth Jackson's cursive a quiet anchor in the storm she was still navigating. The room held a dozen others, new hires mostly, fresh-faced and eager, their pens scratching notes while Jess sat silent, the veteran who'd fallen from grace. They didn't know her story, not the full of it, but the whispers followed her anyway, the 18 million view shadow she couldn't shake. She'd seen the video once, late at night when the shame had clawed too loud to ignore. Her red-painted nails gripping the coffee cup, her voice a snarl as she doused Ruth, the old woman's calm a stark rebuke to her rage. It had hit 20 million now, the comments a mix of vitriol and memes, her name a punchline she'd have to live down one day at a time. Her hands tightened around the cup, the styrofoam denting, and she forced a breath, slow and deep, Ruth's words echoing. Breaking's not the start, it's the end. Tom stopped pacing, his eyes landing on her like a hawk spotting prey. Harper, he barked, snapping her back. You're up. Scenario 3, passenger with a cane, first-class ticket, doesn't match your profile. What do you do? The room turned, a dozen pairs of eyes pinning her, and Jess felt the heat crawl up her neck. She stood, her legs shaky but steadying, and cleared her throat, her voice a rasp. I checked the ticket, she said, slow, deliberate. Scan it, confirm the seat. If it's valid, I let him board, no questions, no assumptions. Tom's brow arched, his pen tapping the clipboard. That's it? No standards to protect. The jab stung, a ghost of her old self, and Jess's jaw tightened. Standards don't mean jack if they're wrong, she said, quieter but firm. I learned that the hard way. A murmur rippled through the room, a mix of surprise and curiosity, but Tom just nodded, scribbling something quick. Good enough, he muttered, waving her down, and Jess sank back into her seat, her pulse hammering. It wasn't a win, not really, but it was a step, a brick in the wall she was rebuilding, shaky and rough but hers. She pulled the note from her pocket, tracing the cursive under the table, and felt Ruth's eyes on her. Not here, not now, but always, a steady gaze she couldn't escape, didn't want to. 3 months in, and she was still learning, still breaking, still picking up the pieces one jagged edge at a time. Across the country, Ruth Jackson stood on a balcony overlooking a Chicago runway, the wind tugging at her navy coat, her cane a quiet sentinel at her side. The skyline glittered behind her, a cold sprawl of steel and ambition, but her eyes were on the planes, her planes, taxiing slow under the morning sun. She'd just left a board meeting, hours of charts and projections, her voice cutting through the suits with a calm that silenced the room. At 80 she didn't need to shout. Her name was on the fuselage, her legacy in the sky, a testament to a life that had turned dirt into wings. But today her mind wasn't on the numbers, the routes. It was on Jess Harper, the girl who'd thrown coffee and cracked open a door Ruth hadn't expected to step through. She leaned on the railing, her hands gnarled but steady, and thought of the note she'd handed Jess. Make it mean something, a spur-of-the-moment scribble that had felt right, felt true. Ruth didn't dwell on it long, didn't need to. She'd seen girls like Jess before, scrappy and scared, running from shadows they couldn't name. She'd been one once, hiding in an Alabama barn while her daddy drank away the rent, dreaming of a sky she couldn't touch. But Ruth had touched it, built it, and Jess was a thread in that tapestry now, a chance to see if the dirt could grow something new. She didn't wonder if Jess would make it, didn't care, not really. The chance was enough, the possibility a seed she'd planted and left to the wind. Back in the training room, the session broke for lunch, the new hires filing out with chatter and laughs, leaving Jess alone with her dented cup and her thoughts. She didn't join them, didn't want to face the questions, the glances, and pulled out her phone instead, scrolling to Emily's last text. Coffee tonight? You owe me a story. Jess smiled, faint but real, and typed back, 7 p.m. Got a lot to tell. She hit send, pocketed the phone, and stood, stretching legs stiff from sitting too long. The note stayed in her hand, a weight she carried like a promise, and she stepped into the hall, the fluorescent buzz a steady hum against her pulse. The afternoon brought a curveball, a surprise visitor, a shadow from the flight Jess hadn't expected to see again. David Brooks stepped into the room just as Tom called a break, his gray suit sharp against the drab walls, his dark hair slicked back like he'd walked off a magazine cover. Jess froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips as he caught her eye and nodded, a small, tight gesture that carried more than she could read. Harper, he said, his voice smooth but edged. Got a minute? Tom waved them off, clipboard in hand, and Jess followed David to a corner, her heart thudding, Ruth's note burning a hole in her pocket. Didn't think I'd see you here, she said, her voice low, a shield she couldn't drop. David leaned against the wall, his hands in his pockets, his eyes searching her face, not with pity, not with scorn, but something closer to curiosity. I'm in town for a meeting, he said, heard you were still with the airline. Figured I'd check in. Jess's brow furrowed, her hands clenching the cup. Check in? What? You saw me at my worst, why care now? David's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. Because I saw you after too. That apology on the plane, it stuck with me. Took guts. Jess blinked, the words hitting like a punch she hadn't braced for. Guts. She'd felt like a coward then, choking out words to save her job, but David saw something else, and it rattled her, shook the pieces she was still fitting together. I didn't have a choice, she said, her voice cracking. They made me do it, Victor, Marcus, her. David shook his head, slow and deliberate. Nah, you could have half-assed it, played the victim. You didn't. You owned it, Harper, and that's more than most people do. The room tilted, her breath catching as his words sank in. Owned it? She hadn't thought of it that way, hadn't seen past the shame, the fear, but David's eyes held a mirror she couldn't dodge. I'm still figuring it out, she admitted, quieter now, the note's edge pressing against her palm. 3 months in and I'm still a mess, retraining's kicking my ass and I can't shake the video. David nodded, his gaze steady. Good, he said, blunt but not cruel, means you're feeling it. Mess is where the real stuff happens. You're not the same woman who lost it at the gate, I'd bet on that. Jess's throat tightened, tears prickling she didn't let fall. "You don't know me," she said, but it sounded weak, a reflex she didn't mean. David shrugged, pushing off the wall. "Don't have to. Saw enough. Keep going, Harper. You've got more in you than you think." He clapped her shoulder, a quick, firm gesture, and walked out, leaving her standing there, the cup trembling in her hands, Ruth's note a quiet echo, "Make it mean something." The session resumed, Tom's drone picking up where it left off, but Jess barely heard it. David's words looped in her skull, "More in you than you think." A lifeline she hadn't expected, a crack widening in the wall she'd built. She thought of Ruth, her calm under the storm, her faith in the chance Jess didn't deserve, and felt it shift, felt the pieces of herself she'd broken start to fit, not perfect, not whole, but something new. The retraining wasn't just a punishment now, it was a forge, a fire she'd walk through to find the woman David saw, the one Ruth had bet on. That night, Jess met Emily at the coffee shop, the bell jingling as she stepped in, the warmth a balm against the cold. Emily waved from a booth, her dark hair tied back, her smile bright but cautious. "You look like hell," she said, sliding a mug across, "but better than last time." Jess laughed, small and rough, and sat, wrapping her hands around the coffee. "Thanks, I think," she said, her voice steadying. "Been a day retraining." Then Brooks showed up out of nowhere. Emily's brows shot up, her mug pausing mid-sip. "Brooks? The suit from the flight? What did he want?" Jess sipped her coffee, the bitterness grounding her, and told her, David's visit, his words, the way they'd hit like a spark on dry grass. She pulled out the note, slid it across, and watched Emily's eyes widen as she read. "Ruth gave you this?" Emily asked, her voice soft, a reverence Jess hadn't expected. "Yeah," Jess said, leaning back, "right before she left. Keeps me going even when I want to quit." Emily handed it back, her smile softening. "She saw something in you, Jess, same as Brooks, same as me. You're not done yet." The words hung there, warm and heavy, and Jess felt them settle. A tether to Emily, to David, to Ruth, to the woman she was clawing her way toward. The coffee shop buzzed around them, a waitress calling orders, a kid laughing too loud, and Jess leaned into it, let it wash over her. She wasn't fixed, not close, but she was moving step by shaky step, the shadows of the sky stretching long but not endless. Ruth's planes flew on, her legacy a hum in the distance, and Jess carried her note, her chance, a light she'd follow into the dark she'd made, a road she'd walk until it meant something real. The regional airline office was a squat, gray building on the outskirts of town, its parking lot cracked and weedy, its windows streaked with the dust of a late September wind. Inside, the training room buzzed with a nervous energy, the fluorescent lights flickering like a heartbeat as Jess Harper stood at the front, her navy polo crisp but her hands sweaty, clutching a clipboard she didn't need. 6 months had passed since the gate, since the coffee, since Ruth Jackson's note, "Make it mean something," had burned itself into her pocket and her soul. Today was the end of her probation, the final test of her retraining. A mock flight scenario, a panel of evaluators, a chance to prove she'd clawed her way back from the wreckage she'd made. The room held Tom, the wiry instructor with his eternal frown, Michael Carter from operations, and a new face, Lydia Grant, a senior flight attendant with gray streaks in her hair and eyes that cut like glass. Jess felt their stares, heavy and unyielding, a jury she couldn't charm or outrun. The scenario was simple but loaded. A first-class passenger, elderly, cane in hand, ticket in question. Sound familiar? And Jess had to handle it step by step under the panel's microscope. She'd prepped for weeks, nights spent pacing her apartment, rehearsing lines in the mirror, chasing the ghost of Ruth's calm through every word. The memory of that day, the coffee splashing, her voice a snarl, the 18 million views, still haunted her, a shadow she'd fought to shrink but couldn't erase. Now, 6 months later, 22 million views and counting, she stood here, not the queen of first class, but a woman stripped bare, her pride a pile of dust she'd swept herself. Tom nodded, his clipboard tapping the table. "Start," he said, blunt and final, and Jess took a breath, her sneakers squeaking on the linoleum as she turned to the passenger, a volunteer, an older woman named Clara, her silver hair tied back, her cane tapping a rhythm Jess knew too well. "Ma'am," Jess began, her voice steady but soft, "may I see your boarding pass?" Clara handed it over, her hands trembling slightly, and Jess scanned it. Mock scanner, green light, 1A flashing on the screen. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. "Looks good," she said, handing it back with a small smile. "Welcome aboard. Can I help you with anything?" Clara nodded, her eyes twinkling with something Jess couldn't place. "Just my bag," she said, her voice a rasp, and Jess took it, gentle but firm, guiding her to the seat without a word of doubt. The panel watched, silent, their pens scratching notes as Jess moved through the drill, checking the seatbelt, offering water, her hands steady, her tone even. No sarcasm, no snap, no shadow of the woman who'd lost it at gate 17. She felt their eyes, felt the weight of 6 months, retraining sessions that had flayed her open, nights staring at Ruth's note, coffee dates with Emily where she'd spilled her guts and found them held. Clara settled in, her cane resting against the chair, and Jess stepped back, her breath easing, a quiet pride flickering in her chest. Not loud, not brash, but real, a ember she'd stoked from the ashes. Lydia spoke first, her voice low and sharp. "No pushback, no profiling, clean work, Harper. What's changed?" Jess met her gaze, her hands clasping the clipboard, her knuckles whitening. "I stopped deciding who belongs," she said, slow, deliberate. "Ticket's all I need now. Learned that from someone who didn't have to teach me." Michael's pen paused, his sharp eyes narrowing, and Tom grunted, a rare hint of approval. "Pass," he said, scribbling quick. "You're cleared, back on the line next week." Jess's knees wobbled, but she locked them, a breath escaping she hadn't known she'd held. Clear. 6 months and she'd made it, not whole, not fixed, but through. The panel dismissed her, their chairs scraping as they filed out, but Jess lingered, Clara's eyes still on her, a smile tugging at her lips. "You did good, honey," Clara said, her voice warm, and Jess nodded, a lump in her throat. "Thanks," she said soft and turned to go, the note in her pocket a quiet pulse. She stepped into the hall, the air cooler, the buzz of the office a distant hum, and stopped, her hands trembling as the weight hit. Back on the line, a second chance, a crack she'd widened into a door. She pulled out the note, unfolded it under the flickering light, and traced the cursive, "Make it mean something," a vow she'd kept, shaky and small, but kept. Across the country, Ruth Jackson sat in a hangar outside Atlanta, the cavernous space echoing with the clank of tools and the hum of a jet engine under repair. Her navy coat hung on a hook, her cane tapped the concrete as she walked the line, her silver-streaked hair catching the overhead lights. At 80 she moved slower now, but her eyes were sharp, tracing the plane's wings, her wings, a legacy forged from dust and dreams. She'd spent the morning with mechanics, her voice a steady guide through their questions, her hands pointing out welds she'd learned to spot decades ago. This was her church, her sanctuary, a place where the sky met the ground she'd clawed her way up from, and today, it felt heavier, a weight she couldn't name. She'd heard about Jess. Marcus had called, a rare update. She's back on, passed the test, looks different. Ruth hadn't asked for it, hadn't needed it, but it stuck with her, a thread she'd pulled loose months ago now weaving back. She didn't think of Jess often, didn't have to, but the girl's face flickered in her mind now, wild and broken at the gate, quiet and cracked in the terminal, a mirror of the Ruth who'd once run from nothing until she'd stopped. She leaned on her cane, her breath a soft fog in the hangar's chill, and felt it, a ripple, a seed she'd planted without tending, growing somewhere she couldn't see. The hangar doors rattled open, a gust sweeping in, and Ruth turned, her coat flapping as a figure stepped through. An old friend, Geraldine, a pilot who'd flown her first routes, her hair gray now, her stride still bold. "Ruth," Geraldine called, her voice cutting the noise, "thought I'd find you here. Got news, your girl Harper's back in the air." Ruth's brow lifted, her cane tapping once. "My girl?" she said, her drawl dry, a faint smile tugging her lips. Geraldine grinned, leaning on a toolbox. "Heard it from Tate, she passed her probation clean slate. Figured you'd want to know after what she pulled." Ruth nodded, slow, her eyes drifting to the plane, its wings gleaming under the lights. "Good for her," she said, simple, steady, a verdict she meant but didn't linger on. Geraldine tilted her head, her grin softening. "You gave her that shot, why?" Ruth's smile faded, her gaze sharpening as she turned to the jet. "Didn't give her nothing she didn't take," she said, her voice low, a river over stone. "She's dirt like I was, grows if you let it. I just didn't pull the weed." Geraldine laughed, a bark that echoed, and Ruth's lips twitched, a rare spark of mirth in her calm. Back at the office, Jess drove home, the city blurring past her windshield, the radio a soft hum she didn't hear. She'd called Emily, "I passed drinks tonight?" and gotten a cheer loud enough to crack the line, "Hell yes, 8 p.m. The note sat on the passenger seat, its creases worn from months of handling, a talisman she'd carried through the fire. She parked outside her building, the 5th-floor walk-up looming, and stepped out, the wind tugging at her polo, the sky a bruised purple streaked with jet trails. She paused, her eyes tracing the planes, Ruth's planes, a hum she felt in her bones, a connection she couldn't name but couldn't shake. The stairs creaked under her weight, her legs tired but steady, and she reached her door, the key turning smooth for once. Inside, the dim quiet welcomed her, the fridge's rattle a familiar friend, and she dropped her bag, sinking onto the couch. The note came out, unfolded on the table, and Jess stared at it, her hands resting on her knees, her breath slow. 6 months, retraining, David's nod, Emily's faith, Ruth's shadow, and she'd made it, not to the top, not to glory, but to here, a place she could stand without running. She thought of her dad's bottles, her mom's hunched back, the kid she'd been, and let them go, not gone, not forgotten, but lighter, dust she didn't need to carry. The doorbell buzzed, sharp and sudden, and Jess frowned, hauling herself up. She opened it, expecting Emily early, but froze. Ruth Jackson stood there, her navy coat dusted with travel, her cane tapping the floor, her dark eyes locking on Jess with a calm that stopped time. "Mrs. Jackson," Jess breathed, her voice a crack, her hands gripping the frame. Ruth tilted her head, her smile faint but real. "Heard you passed," she said, her drawl warm, a river in the quiet. "Figured I'd see for myself." Jess's knees buckled, but she caught herself, her throat tight as Ruth stepped in, her cane steady, her presence filling the room. I don't know what to say," Jess stammered, her hands trembling as she shut the door, Ruth's note burning in her mind. Ruth settled on the couch, her coat folding around her, her eyes tracing the small space. Chipped table, worn cushions, a life rebuilt from scraps. "Don't need to say nothing," she said, her voice low, "just listen. You made it mean something, saw it in your eyes back there. That's enough." Jess sank into a chair, her breath hitching, tears prickling. She didn't fight. "I tried," she said, raw, real. "Every day I tried, for you, for me." Ruth nodded, her cane tapping once, her gaze softening but unyielding. "Good," she said, simple, final. "Keep trying. Dirt don't stop growing, lest you choke it." She stood, slow and steady, and handed Jess a new note. Smaller, simpler, "Keep growing." Jess took it, her fingers shaking, and Ruth turned, her cane tapping to the door, her navy coat a quiet banner as she stepped out, leaving Jess with a gift she couldn't repay. The room hummed, the city pulsed beyond the walls, and Jess held the notes. Old and new, a promise she'd keep, a dust she'd turn to wings, one flight, one stranger, one day at a time. The sky above stretched endless and bruised, a late October canvas of purples and grays swirling over the tarmac as Jess Harper stood at gate 23, her navy uniform crisp, her badge gleaming anew on her chest. It was her first flight back, 6 months of probation behind her, the retraining gauntlet survived, Ruth Jackson's notes, "Make it mean something and keep growing," tucked like talismans in her pocket. The terminal buzzed around her, a symphony of rolling suitcases and hurried voices, but Jess felt it differently now, the pulse of lives crossing paths, not threats to her control. She adjusted her bun, her blonde hair pulled tight, and took a breath, the cold air sharp against her throat. The Boeing 737 waited beyond the glass, its engines humming low, a beast she'd ride again, not as a queen but as a steward, a role she'd earned back one shaky step at a time. Emily stood beside her, her dark hair tied back, her smile a mix of pride and nerves. "You ready?" she asked, her voice cutting through the din, her hand brushing Jess's arm. Jess nodded, her lips twitching into a faint grin. "As I'll ever be," she said, her voice steady but laced with a tremor she couldn't hide. "First class again, feels like a lifetime." Emily laughed, soft and warm, a tether Jess had clung to through the months of doubt. "You've got this," she said, firm. "You're not that woman anymore." Ruth made sure of that. Jess's hand slipped to her pocket, the notes a quiet weight, and she nodded again, her eyes on the jet bridge, the path ahead a line she'd walk with new eyes. The boarding call crackled overhead, and Jess moved to the counter, her sneakers replaced by polished flats, her clipboard a steady anchor as passengers lined up. First class first, suits with briefcases, a couple with designer bags, faces she scanned with a calm she'd fought to find. She checked tickets, smiled small but real, her voice a low hum of welcome. "Good afternoon, enjoy your flight." No snap, no sneer, just a rhythm she'd learned, a job she'd reclaimed not for power but for purpose. Emily flanked her, her scanner beeping green, their teamwork a silent dance forged over coffee confessions and late-night calls. The line thinned, the last first-class passengers trickling through, and Jess felt a flicker of relief, smooth, steady, a start she could build on. But then a shadow fell across the counter, a tap of wood on linoleum pulling her eyes up, and her breath caught. An old man stood there, his gray coat patched at the elbows, his hands gnarled around a cane, his dark eyes sharp under a worn cap. He handed her a boarding pass, creased and faded, and Jess's heart thudded, a ghost of Ruth flickering in his stance, his quiet. She scanned it, 1A green light, no error, and handed it back, her voice soft but firm. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said. "Can I help you with anything?" He nodded, slow, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Just my bag," he rasped, his voice a gravelly echo, and Jess took it, light but steady, guiding him toward the jet bridge. The crowd parted, their eyes glancing then drifting, but Jess felt it, a weight, a test she hadn't prepped for, a mirror of the day she'd broken. She walked beside him, her flats matching his shuffle, her hand hovering near his elbow, not touching, just there. "First time flying?" she asked, gentle, a bridge she hadn't built 6 months ago. He chuckled, low and dry. "Nah, been up plenty, used to fix 'em back when they were props. Name's Amos." Jess smiled, real now, her chest easing as they reached the plane. "Jess," she said, setting his bag in the overhead, "used to think I ran him, learned better." Amos settled into 1A, his cane resting against the armrest, and tipped his cap, his eyes twinkling. "Good lesson," he said, cryptic but warm, and Jess stepped back, her breath steady, a quiet victory humming in her veins. She'd passed, not Tom's test, not Victor's verdict, but hers, a moment she'd made mean something without spilling a drop. The flight climbed smooth, the cabin humming at 35,000 feet, and Jess moved through the aisle, her tray steady, her hands sure. First class sipped their drinks. Bourbon for a suit, wine for a woman in pearls, but Amos took water, his gnarled fingers wrapping the glass as he watched her with eyes that saw too much. "You're good at this," he said low as she passed, and Jess paused, her tray dipping slightly. "Trying to be," she said, honest, soft, "took a while to get here." Amos nodded, his cap tilting. "Takes a while to fix anything worth keeping," he said, and Jess felt it, a thread, a tie to Ruth she couldn't place, a wisdom that lingered like dust on wings. The flight hit turbulence halfway, a jolt that rattled the cabin, glasses clinking, murmurs rising. Jess steadied herself, her voice cutting through. "Folks, just a bump, stay seated, we're fine." She moved to Amos, his water sloshing, and crouched, her hand on the armrest. "You okay, sir?" she asked, her eyes searching his, no panic, just care. He grinned, faint but real. "Been through worse," he said. "You're steady, good sign." Jess nodded, her throat tight, and stood, the plane leveling as she moved on, her calm a shield she'd forged from the chaos she'd caused. Back on the ground, the plane emptied, passengers filing out with nods and thanks, and Jess stood at the door, her badge catching the light, her smile small but earned. Amos was last, his cane tapping slow as he reached her, his coat brushing the frame. "Good flight," he said, pausing, his eyes locking on hers. "Got something for you, old friend asked me to pass it along." Jess frowned, her pulse quickening as he pulled a folded paper from his pocket, its edges worn, its weight familiar. She took it, her hands trembling, and unfolded it. A note, Ruth's cursive steady and clear. "You're enough." Jess's breath hitched, tears prickling as Amos tipped his cap. "Knew Ruth back in '62, he said, his voice a rasp. "Fixed her first plane, stubborn as hell, that woman. Heard about you, said you'd need this someday. Guess today's the day." He turned, his cane tapping away, leaving Jess with the note, her chest cracking open, Ruth's words a flood she couldn't hold back. "You're enough." Not a command, not a challenge. A gift, a grace she hadn't sought, hadn't known she craved. Emily found her there, the plane silent, Jess's hands shaking as she clutched the note. "What's that?" she asked, her voice soft, her eyes wide. Jess handed it over, her voice breaking. "Ruth," she said, simple, raw, through him, "Amos said I'm enough." Emily read it, her smile trembling, and pulled Jess into a hug, tight and fierce. "She's right," she whispered. "You are, always were." Jess clung back, tears spilling now, the note a lifeline, Ruth's echo a hum in the altitude she'd finally reached. Across the sky, Ruth Jackson sat in her Atlanta hangar, her navy coat draped over a chair, her cane tapping the concrete as she watched a jet roll out, its wings gleaming under the dusk. She didn't know Jess had the note, didn't need to. She'd written it months ago, handed it to Amos with a nod, a hunch she'd trusted to the wind. Her planes flew on, her legacy a roar she'd built from nothing, and Jess was a speck in that vastness, a seed that had grown where Ruth couldn't see. She leaned on her cane, her breath a soft fog, and smiled, faint but real, a woman who'd sown dirt into sky, who'd given a chance and let it soar. Jess drove home, the city lights blurring past, the notes, 3 now, a trinity in her pocket. Make it mean something. Keep growing. You're enough. She parked, climbed the stairs, and stepped into her dim apartment, the quiet a balm. She set the notes on the table side by side and sank onto the couch, her hands steady, her breath deep. The flight replayed, Amos's eyes, the turbulence, Ruth's words, and Jess felt it, a peace she'd chased through 6 months of dust, a worth she'd found not in rising but in standing still. The planes roared on, the sky stretched wide, and Jess Harper sat there, enough at last, her wings forged from echoes she'd never lose.